I'm not a hero. I stand at the end of a long, long line of good Dutch people who did what I did, or more, much more, during those dark and terrible times years ago. Never a day goes by that I do not think what happened then. My story is a story of very ordinary people during extraordinary, terrible times. Times the like of which I hope with all my heart will never, never come again. It is for all of us, ordinary people, all over the world, to see to it that they do not. Amsterdam was not my native city.
Amsterdam was not my native city. I had been born in Vienna, Austria in 1909. I was not the strongest child, and because of the serious food shortages during the First World War, I had become undernourished and sick. When I was 11, I was to be sent with other Austrian workers' children to the faraway country called the Netherlands to be fed and revitalized. My stay in Holland was to have been for 3 months, but I was still weak by that time, and the doctors extended it another 3 months, and then another. Quickly, my adoptive family began to absorb me. They started to consider me one of them. At first, they called me by my proper name, Hermine, but as the ice between us melted, they found the name too formal and began calling me by an affectionate Dutch nickname, Miep. I took to Dutch life quite naturally. Gezellig, or coziness, is the Dutch theme. I learned to ride a bicycle, to butter my bread sandwiches on 2 sides. I was taught a love of classical music by these people, and that it was my duty to be politically aware and read the newspaper each evening, later discussing what I'd read. I was 24 in 1933. It was a difficult year for me. Times were bad and unemployment was high. But being a young woman with an independent spirit, I was longing for work. I had heard of a job through a neighbor and glanced at the paper she gave me. It read, Mr. Otto Frank, N.Z. Voorburgwal, 120-126. Bright and early on Monday morning, I lifted my sturdy second-hand black bicycle down the steep front steps, careful not to muss my freshly washed and ironed skirt and blouse. Then, pedaling at my usual breakneck speed, my skirt billowing out around me, I weaved effortlessly in and out through the flowing stream of workers on bicycles whooshing towards their jobs in the Centrum, the business center of Amsterdam. The firm of Travis and Company was contained in a small 2-room office. The room was not bright, and besides what looked like a shipping area, it contained a wooden desk with a black typewriter and a black telephone on top. Before I could observe further, a soft, heavily accented voice called out to me from the second office. In a shy but gentlemanly way, this tall, slim, smiling man introduced himself, as did I, and began the usual preliminaries of a job interview. He apologized for his poor Dutch, explaining that he had very recently come from Frankfurt, Germany, so recently, in fact, that his wife and children had not yet joined him. I gladly spoke German to make things easier for him. A ripple of gratitude shone in his eyes as he switched back into the comfort of his native language. His name was Otto Frank. He must have responded favorably to me, because he asked me to accompany him into the kitchen. Did I have the job? I couldn't imagine what he could want in the kitchen. Naturally, I followed him. I was introduced in passing to another person, Mr. Kraler, with whom Mr. Frank shared his office. Travis and Company specialized in products for the homemaker, and among them was one called pectin. The housewife combined it with sugar, fresh fruit, and various other ingredients to make her own jam in about 10 minutes. He handed me a sheet of paper with the recipe and told me to make jam. For the next 2 weeks I stayed in the small kitchen making pot after pot of jam. Each day Mr. Frank bought a sackful of different fruit. Very quickly I got the hang of it, and by the 3rd or 4th day had become something of an expert. My jams were always perfect, good, bright color, stiff consistency, juicy flavor. Mr. Frank suggested that we take jam home to our families. He took none for himself, as he was living alone until his family could be brought to Amsterdam to join him. Mr. Frank said little about his family, just that he had had a wife named Edith and 2 very young daughters, Margot Betty, the elder, and Anneliese Marie, the baby whom for short he called Anna. I sensed that he was lonesome, that he was a family man without his family. Naturally, I said nothing about it. It would be too personal a subject. Mr. Frank and I quickly established a rapport, discovering our common passion for politics. We found ourselves on the same side of things. Although I had been brought up not to hate, I certainly did not like the fanatic Adolf Hitler, who had recently seized power in Germany. Mr. Frank felt the same way, although much more personally, as he was Jewish. Mr. Frank had left Germany because of Hitler's anti-Jewish policies. Fortunately, Mr. Frank had come to Holland, and soon his family would be safely living here as well. Holding our little discussions in German, we agreed that it was just as well to turn one's back on Hitler's Germany and be secure and protected by our adopted homeland. Mr. Kahler, who shared the office, was a husky, good-looking man, dark-haired and precise. He was always serious, never joked. He was about 33 years old. So far, Mr. Kahler had almost nothing to do with me, and because of my easy feeling with Mr. Frank, I was glad to be under his jurisdiction. Mr. Frank must have been satisfied with me because he began to give me other work to do, like bookkeeping, typing, dealing with customer complaints, and giving out information. One day Mr. Frank told me, with a pleased look on his face, that he had rented an apartment in my quarter, the River Quarter, in South Amsterdam, where many German refugees like himself had recently begun to live. At last, his family had come from Germany. I could see that he was happy. One morning, in walked a round-faced, conservatively well-dressed woman, her dark hair tied in a bun. She was in her 30s. Beside her walked a tiny, dark-haired little girl wearing a snow-white fur coat. Mr. Frank introduced me in German to his wife, Edith Frank Hollander. Mrs. Frank presented herself as one would who came from a cultured, wealthy background, aloof but sincere. And then, in a smiling voice, Mr. Frank introduced me to his younger daughter, Anna. The little girl in the white, fluffy fur coat looked up at me and then curtsied. I could see that little Anna was shy and hanging against her mother at first, but her dark, shining, alert, large eyes, which dominated her delicate face, were drinking in everything around her. Anna and I walked toward my desk. She looked with fascination at my shiny black typewriter. I held her little fingers to the keys and pressed. Her eyes flashed when the keys jumped up and printed black letters onto the invoice rolled into the machine. Then I directed her attention to the window. Just the kind of lively scene I thought a child would like. I was right. The view caught her interest, the streetcars, bicycles, the passers-by. Watching Anne, I thought, now, here's the kind of child I'd like to have some day. Quiet, obedient, and curious about everything. Each morning I'd pack my lunch and bicycle to the office. But the office was not the only thing in my life. I loved to dance and belonged, like many young Dutch girls, to a dance club. I was one of the first girls in Amsterdam to learn the Charleston, the two-step, the tango, and the slow fox. I also kept company with various attractive young men, including a very tall, well-dressed, highly appealing Dutchman a few years older than I. His name was Henk Gies. I found Henk most attractive. His thick, fair hair gleamed. His eyes were warm and full of life. In 1937, Travis and Company moved in single 400, occupying several floors in a gabled old canal house with a workroom below. Our new location was 2 steps from the beautiful floating flower market overlooking the curving single canal, one of the most charming waterways in central Amsterdam. Sometimes Henk Gies and I would take a short stroll at lunchtime together. Mr. Frank had met Henk several times this way and took note that he was becoming a steady companion. One day Mr. Frank invited Henk and I to come to his home for dinner. I accepted, honored to be invited home by my boss to share a meal with his family. Although Mrs. Frank was progressing with her Dutch, she still spoke with a strong accent, much stronger than Mr. Frank's. Henk was fluent in German also, so we all spoke German in our conversation. The apartment's furnishings had been brought from Frankfurt, and there were many antiques, mostly in polished dark woods, several imposing pieces, large and dark. I especially admired a delicate, tall secretary in a 19th century French style standing between 2 windows. Mrs. Frank mentioned that it had been part of her dowry. A stately old grandfather clock ticked softly in the background. It was an Ackermann, made in Frankfurt. My eye caught a dreamy charcoal sketch hanging in a fine frame on the wall. It was of a large cat with 2 little kittens beside her nursing. Everywhere were signs that children dominated this house. Drawings, playthings. We were seated at the table, and Margot and Anna were called. Anna was now 8 years old, still somewhat thin and delicate, but with electric gray-green eyes with green flecks. She had her mother's nose and her father's mouth, but with a slight overbite and cleft chin. We were meeting Margot for the first time. She was 10 years old, very pretty, also with shiny dark hair. She was shy and quiet with us, and very, very well-mannered, as was little Anna. Margot's smile made her face even prettier. Both girls spoke perfect Dutch. Margot seemed to be Mommy's little girl, and Anna was very much her daddy's. As she left, I noticed Anna's socks droop slightly around her thin ankles in a touching, comical way. A wave of tenderness rose in my heart. I suppressed a smile and the desire to reach down and pull her socks back up around her ankles. Henk Gies and I began to spend more and more time together. We slowly were discovering how much we had in common, like Mozart, whom we both loved. How pleased we were when we discovered that we both loved a particular concerto for flute and harp. When Henk and I were together, I would sometimes catch a look of approval in someone's eye at the picture we cut together. We both prided ourselves on being well-dressed. In fact, Henk always looked very elegant. I never saw him without a tie. His blue eyes sparkled with vitality. Our mutual attraction was magnetic. People who observed us could not help feeling it too. We were both crazy about the Sunday market in the old Jewish quarter very close to the stately Portuguese synagogue just across the Amstel River. In this quarter lived the poorer Jewish people of Amsterdam. Long ago, Jews from countries to the east had found their way into Holland. Recently, German Jewish refugees had come. Now, however, it was becoming quite difficult for Jews and other refugees to enter Holland. The flood of refugees had narrowed to a trickle. We wondered where the unwanted refugees would go. And especially, where would the German Jews go, as Hitler was making them more and more unwelcome in Germany? Who would take them in? One day in March 1938, the whole office stood together listening to Mr. Frank's radio as the dramatic voice announced Hitler's triumphal entry into the city of my youth, Vienna. I ached inside. I imagined the hysterical joy of the Austrian rabble that cheered him on. I was reminded of my Austrian passport and deeply regretted that I hadn't taken the time to rid myself of it. Shortly afterward, I made my annual visit to the aliens department to have my visa extended. That year, 1938, to my shock and dismay, I was sent to the German consulate, where my Austrian passport was taken away, and in return I was given a German passport with a black swastika stamped next to my photograph. On paper now, my nationality was German. But this was nonsense, because in my heart I was Dutch, through and through. Several weeks later, I was at home one evening with my adopted family, when there came a knock at the door. There stood a very blonde young woman about my age. She explained that she, like me, was a German. The purpose of her visit was to invite me to join a Nazi girls' club. "How can I join such a club?" I asked. "Look what the Germans are doing to the Jews in Germany." Her eyes narrowed on my face with a fixed stare. I bade her good night and closed the front door. That November, one of our evenings with the Frank family was particularly fraught with unhappiness over recent world news. A few nights previously was the infamous Crystal Night, November the 10th, 1938. On this night, hundreds of Jewish businesses, shops, and homes had been smashed and burned in Germany. Jewish synagogues had been destroyed, along with Jewish holy books, and thousands of Jewish people had been beaten or shot, women raped, and defenseless children attacked. In an inferno of broken glass and destruction, thousands of Jews had been gathered up and deported to parts unknown. Around this time, a new refugee joined Travis and Company. He was an old business acquaintance of Mr. Frank's. He was to be our advisor expert in the spice business, as Mr. Frank was rapidly expanding the company. His name was Herman von Dahn, and although he was by origin a Dutch-born Jew, he had lived for many years in Germany. His wife was a German Jew. He too had left Germany with his family when Hitler came to power. The name of the spice business was Pecticon. There was nothing about spices that Mr. von Dahn didn't know. With one sniff of his nose he could name any spice. He was a tall, large man, well-dressed, who stooped slightly when he walked, although he was only in his middle 40s. Von Dahn was quite an agreeable sort, and had no trouble fitting into the routine of Travis and Company and Pecticon. When Mr. Frank and Mr. von Dahn put their heads together, they came up with successful ideas for marketing our products and finding new customers. The Franks began holding open house at their home, with coffee and cake, on an occasional Saturday afternoon. Hank and I were sometimes invited to these gatherings. There were usually 7 or 8 other guests, all Germans, mostly Jewish refugees who had fled from Hitler's Germany. Mr. Frank always introduced Hank Gies and me as our Dutch friends. Mr. von Dahn often came and brought his pretty, coquettish wife, Petronella. Another man frequently invited was a dental surgeon named Albert Dussel. He was a handsome man, a charmer who resembled the romantic French singer Maurice Chevalier. At these Saturday gatherings we all sat around a large, round, dark oak table in the Franks' living room. The table was filled with coffee cups, creamers, Mrs. Frank's beautiful polished silver, and delicious homemade cake. Everyone talked at once. Everyone knew every detail of the latest developments around the world, and especially those concerning Germany. When Czechoslovakia was occupied by Hitler in March of 1939, our voices rose in angry discussion. Always the conversation eventually returned to life in Germany before those present had had to flee their homeland. Difficult as things now were, our German friends were careful about their complaints. When times were hard for the adults, the children never knew. All these people were hard workers who had put together decent lives. None of them had imagined that they would be forced to tear up their roots and flee their homeland and begin again in middle years in a foreign country. Fortunately, they had come to Holland, as free and tolerant a place as any that existed. Throughout early 1939, and especially after the occupation of Czechoslovakia, we grew more concerned about Hitler. We knew he could not be trusted. The mood during the spring and summer was watchful and nervous. The tension forced Hank and me to take a look at our situation. A deep bond of true love had developed between us. Neither of us had made a formal commitment because we had such modest incomes, almost no savings, nothing to use to buy furniture and begin a life. Poorer couples like us always had such long engagements. But we decided to throw caution to the wind. Time was passing, and neither of us getting younger. I'd turned 30, Henk was approaching 34. We decided that as soon as we could find an apartment, we would get married. We began the almost impossible task of finding a place to live right away. Amsterdam always had a tradition of sheltering people who had run from tyranny of one sort or another. Despite the tight immigration laws, the city was now bursting full of refugees, both political and religious. Everyone was squeezing someone extra into an attic room or an unused basement. Families took in lodgers, and sometimes the lodgers took in lodgers. The city's population had outgrown its housing. There just wasn't any more room. As we continued our unsuccessful quest for an apartment, the event we had all been waiting for finally occurred. It was September the 1st, 1939, and Hitler's army had marched into Poland. Then, on September the 3rd, France declared war on Germany. Holland sat right in the midst of these three countries. I wanted Hitler to be put down, murdered, anything. Then, as I reflected on these feelings, I realized how much I had changed. Murder was an unthinkable crime, and here I was, full of hate and murderous thoughts. In January 1940, Mr. Frank told us that he had found new offices with abundant space for the company. The new building was at Prinsengracht 263. It was a narrow, gabled, red brick building that had originally been built in the 17th century. It was very much like many of the old buildings in this part of Amsterdam. Soon afterward, Mr. Frank called me into his office and introduced a young girl whom he had been interviewing. I could tell right away that she was painfully shy. Her name was Ellie Vossen. Mr. Frank had just hired her to work in the office. She was 21 years old. I took Ellie under my wing and put her at the desk across from me. Right away, Ellie and I were a good team and became friendly. We began to eat our lunch and take walks together and talk to each other about this and that. Shortly after we moved, Mr. Frank also took a middle-aged Dutch gentleman into the company. His name was Joe Koophuis. He had had various business dealings with Mr. Frank over the years, and was a personal friend as well. He was a quiet person whose personality immediately inspired feelings of trust and kindness. Mr. Koophuis and I quickly established a warm rapport. Joe Koophuis, Ellie Vossen, the other office girls, and I began to share the front office. Kahler and Von Dahn continued to share another in the back. In fact, these men seemed to have formed two teams. Koophuis and Frank specializing in the household products and the financial business, and Von Dahn and Kahler dealing in spices, especially spices used for sausage making. I had become the senior office worker. It was up to me to make sure our responsibilities were always completed, that our work was done with efficiency and order and was always neat and clean. Margot Frank turned 14 in February of 1940. One day after I turned 31. During dinner at the Franks that winter, we realized that we were seeing a young lady rather than a girl. Her figure had filled out quite a bit. Thick eyeglasses now covered her serious dark eyes, and her attention was always on bookish matters and never on frivolity. Anna was not quite 11 that chilly winter of 1940. She clearly looked up to her older sister. Anything Margot did or said was quickly absorbed by Anna's darting eyes and quick mind. In fact, Anna had developed the skill of mimicry. She loved having an attentive audience and loved to hear us respond to her skits and clowning. Anna had changed, too. She was still a small, thin girl, but her arms and legs seemed to suddenly be too long for the body. The spring of 1940 burst upon us. The earth thawed. The flower stalls were full of moist, tight tulips, jonquils, daffodils. The silky air and the lengthening days gave us all feelings of hope for the situation in Europe. Henk and I spent every free moment together. As spring grew lovelier, Henk grew even more handsome and delightful in my eyes. His jokes seemed funnier, his arm around my shoulder grew firmer. But then Hitler marched right into little Denmark, and with equal effortlessness into Norway. Barely a shot had been fired in either place. Everyone in Holland had the same fear. We waited to see what would happen next. Early one Friday morning in May, my sleep was interrupted when I heard what sounded like a persistent humming noise. Then the noise was mixed with a faraway muted sound of thunder. My heart began to pound. I ran downstairs to join the family and try to figure out what was happening. The radio reports were confusing. Word came that German soldiers dressed in Dutch uniforms were parachuting out of airplanes. Also that bicycles and guns and equipment were coming down from the sky. No one had ever seen or heard anything like it. Dawn broke. The confusion continued. No one went back to sleep. We were all too upset. Finally, Queen Wilhelmina spoke on the radio and told us, her voice heavy with emotion, that the Germans had attacked our beloved Holland. We were being invaded, but we were fighting back. It was Friday, May 10th, 1940. No one knew quite what to do. Most people like me went to work just as we did every other day. Several times in the course of the day there were air raid sirens. However, no bombs fell, and I saw no fighting, no men in uniform. At 8 o'clock, curfew went into effect. We were told to tape over the glass in our windows, that this might protect us from splintering and flying glass. We were told to buy blackout paper to cover our windows at night. All the time my head was against the radio. The information was confused and alarming. Then the worst news yet, that the Queen, her family, and the government had fled in the night on a ship to England. They'd taken all the gold from the Dutch treasury with them. A wave of dejection went through us all. Then it was said that Prince Bernard, Princess Juliana's husband, had come back and rejoined the Dutch troops in Zeeland. As suddenly as it had started, it was finished. At 7 in the evening of May 14, General Winkelmann came onto the radio and announced that the Germans had obliterated Rotterdam with bombs dropped from the air. In order to spare further loss of life and property, the general explained that we were surrendering to the Germans. Like the lowest thieves in the night, the Nazis had attacked us. Now, suddenly our world was no longer ours. We waited to see what would happen. All the while, rage smoldered inside. Nothing worse could happen to us. We were no longer free. We began to see German uniforms here and there in the street. The German army paraded through Amsterdam looking triumphant in uniforms and helmets. The Dutch watched, most faces set, unreadable, quiet. To us there were only two sides, those who were right, those loyal Dutch who, no matter what, opposed the Nazis, and those who were wrong, who collaborated or sympathized with the Nazis. There was nothing in between. Life went on almost as usual. Business at Travis and Company continued to prosper. We worked quietly all day long. 4 times each hour bells rang out through the building, the bells from the Westerkerk, or West Church, down the street where Rembrandt's bones were buried. One day Mr. Frank took me aside, and a pleased look on his face told me that he had read an advertisement for rooms that were for rent in our quarters at 25 Hunsestraat. Were we interested? The following morning before going to work, I met Mr. Frank, and together we went to a quiet street only 2 blocks from the Franks' apartment on Mervedeplein. A small, pretty lady, dark and plump, answered. Her name was Mrs. Sampson. Mr. Frank made the appropriate introductions, and we all shook hands. We realized that Mrs. Sampson was Jewish. Then she showed us the rooms. On the spot, I told her that we would like to rent her rooms. Hank and I would move in right away. She expressed relief. It would be good to have young, strong people in these rooms during times like these. When we first moved in, we told her that we were married, but rather quickly, as we got to know her, we told her that it wasn't true, but that soon, we hoped, we would be married. These unusual times were quickly making for unusual arrangements. News came that Luxembourg and Belgium had fallen almost as quickly as the Netherlands had, that Germany had successfully invaded France, and that fighting continued, that a man named Winston Churchill had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of England. We began to realize that we hadn't been abandoned by Queen Wilhelmina. She spoke movingly to us Dutch on the BBC radio. She told us to remain calm and not to lose heart, to resist the Nazis any way we could, and that somehow, someday, we would be a free nation once again. The radio now played nothing but German music all day. The movie theaters showed only German films. It was decreed against the law to listen to the BBC. This had no effect on us, as all hope and encouragement came from the BBC. Then, in late July, Radio Orange, the voice of the Dutch government in exile in London, began nightly and was like a drink to the thirsty. As the newspapers had stopped printing anything but the German news, we knew nothing about what was going on in the outside world and longed for information. So each night, although listening was illegal, we'd all gather around our radios for Radio Orange. Despite their constant anxiety, our Dutch Jews so far had been treated no differently from anyone else. In August, Jewish refugees from Germany were told to report to the aliens' office to register, which they did. No harm came to them. They were registered, that was all. In August, Hitler began to send hundreds of bombers across the Channel to England. First one wave would come, then another. The droning of these harbingers of death formed a background to my nightly sleep. The BBC spoke of bombings over Berlin. Hope would surge. Then the German radio spoke of London burning and that the British were almost at the point of capitulation. Our hearts would sink, our rage churn. The swinish Dutch Nazis, known as NSB'ers, joined up with the German Nazis. They received special treatment and privileges. We gave these snakes a wide berth. Not always did one know who was right and who was wrong. So we never spoke about the war to anyone if we were not sure. Sometimes now, when I went shopping, I would find the shops half empty. The Germans had begun to take our food and ship it back to their fatherland. Jewish despondency deepened when in the autumn of 1940 Dutch Jews in civil service and in other public and government positions, like teachers and professors and postmen, were ordered to resign their jobs. Others, like Hank, had to sign an Aryan declaration, which was an archly written statement that said essentially, "I am not a Jew." We were shocked at these edicts, shocked, enraged, and ashamed, because so many dignified and learned people had been dismissed in such a heartless way. None of this changed life at Travis and Company. Mr. Frank and Mr. von Dahn did their best to hide whatever fear and dejection they felt. Everyone behaved as normally as possible with them. By decree of October the 22nd, 1940, however, our company had been ordered to register along with all other businesses owned by Jews or having one or more Jewish partner. It started insidiously, but as the long, dark winter settled over us, the noose around the Jewish neck began to tighten. First, all our Jews were made to register with the census office. Then it was whispered that in The Hague, not 35 miles from Amsterdam, signs were appearing on park benches and in public places saying, "Not for Jews," and Jews not wanted here. Could such a thing be true in the Netherlands? The answer became clear as outbreaks of anti-Semitism occurred in Amsterdam. Violent fights broke out between Jews and Nazis in the old Jewish quarter near the marketplace. The Germans used this as an excuse to raise the bridges around the quarter, post soldiers, and seal off the quarter with signs. 400 Jewish hostages were seized from the old Jewish quarter in February. They were gathered in a razzia, a Dutch word for round up at gunpoint, and shipped away by truck. They were shipped to a place called Mauthausen, a prison camp. Quickly word came that these men had met with accidental deaths. Families were notified of death by heart attack and tuberculosis. No one believed these stories. The Dutch are slow to anger, but when they do, their anger will burn white hot. In order to show the full measure of indignity we Dutch felt about the treatment of the Jews, we called a general strike for February the 25th. All transportation and industry ground to a halt. Before the German occupation, Holland had had a great many different parties and political groups. Now, suddenly, we were all one, anti-German. The February strike lasted for 3 marvelous days. The morale of the Dutch Jews rose tremendously. Everyone felt the solidarity that the strike inspired. Dangerous, yes, but wonderful to be doing something against our oppressors. But after 3 days, the Nazis reasserted themselves with brutal reprisals. Hank and I hadn't been to the Frank home for quite some time. We felt deep anxiety for our Jewish friends. If only our Jewish friends had gone to America or Canada. When we did again see the Franks, we noticed that since the occupation, Margot's poor health had been aggravated by anxieties. She was sick quite often, but she managed not to let anything interfere with her studies. Meanwhile, Anna was evolving into the most extroverted person in the family. She was aware of everything going on in the outside world. She was very indignant about the injustices being heaped on the Jewish people. In addition to all of Anna's many interests, like famous film stars and her best girlfriends, a new subject had gotten her attention: boys. It was as though the terrible events in the outside world were speeding up this little girl's development, as though Anna was suddenly in a hurry to know and experience everything. On the outside, Anna looked like a delicate, vivacious, not quite 12-year-old girl, but on the inside, a part of her was suddenly much older. Out of the blue, I received a summons to appear at the German consulate. I was filled with fear and foreboding. I dressed with great care, and Hank and I went together to the German consulate on the Museumplein. The place exuded a sinister feeling. I went in alone. Inside, the official simply demanded my passport and looked at me as though I were a speck of dirt. My heart was pounding. All the while, terrible thoughts raced through my head. They would send me back to Vienna. I would never again see my dear Henk. That they would try to get me to join the Dutch Nazi Party. Something would happen to my relatives still living in Vienna. Finally, the official returned with my passport in his hand. He asked if it was true that I had refused to join a Nazi girls' club. I recalled the visit of the young girl many months before and replied that it was true. With an icy look in his eye, he handed me my passport and told me that it had been invalidated. I was ordered back to Vienna within 3 months. On the page that showed how long my passport was valid, he had put a big black X. Not knowing what to do, I went to the aliens department of the police, where in the past I had gone each year to register. There I was told the only alternative I had was to marry a Dutchman, and I had only 3 months to obtain my birth certificate from Vienna. Even in normal times, it would take probably a year or more to get a legal document sent. I ran home and quickly wrote to my Uncle Anton in Vienna to please send my birth certificate. And so the waiting began. The Germans continued to advance. The radio was full of announcements that the Germans were on the verge of conquering Greece and Yugoslavia, and that Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania had been totally occupied, just as we were. The Greeks surrendered in April 1941. The newspapers showed the swastika flying above the Acropolis as it had flown in France. At the same time, a rash of new anti-Jewish edicts sprang up. Suddenly, Jews were prohibited from staying in hotels or going to cafes, movie theaters, restaurants, libraries, even public parks. Worst of all, Jews were told to surrender their radios to the police. To be without this lifeline to the outside world was unimaginable. The radio was the source of all news and hope. Finally, Uncle Anton wrote, but his letter said only that he needed my passport in order to obtain my birth certificate. Mr. Frank had a suggestion. Why don't you make a photocopy of the page that shows your picture and the official German stamp with the swastika? Tell your uncle to say that you can't send your complete passport as you can't walk around without it these days in Holland. I did as Mr. Frank suggested. Every day as I waited for news from Uncle Anton, new edicts were issued against the Jews. Now Jewish doctors and dentists could not treat non-Jews. I ignored this and continued my treatments with Dr. Dussel. Jews were not permitted to bathe in public swimming pools. I wondered where Anna and Margot Frank and their friends would go to cool off in the summertime. Jews were ordered to buy the Jewish weekly in which these new edicts were published. Perhaps the Germans thought that this way we Christians would not know what was happening to the Jews, but word of every new measure spread like fire. Finally, in June, when it seemed that all was lost, another letter from Uncle Anton arrived. I held my breath and opened it. Out fell my neatly folded birth certificate. Hank and I immediately ran down to Amsterdam City Hall to set a date for our wedding. But our happiness quickly drained out of us when we were told that when a Dutch person marries a foreigner, the foreign person's passport must be turned into the City Hall clerk. We were in shock. My passport had a big X and was invalid. If the clerk was a Nazi sympathizer, I would be deported. With our hearts in our throats, we made an appointment to be married on July the 16th, 1941. We would throw our fate to the wind. The sun was shining down on July the 16th, a beautiful storybook summer day in Amsterdam. I dressed in my best tailored coat and hat, Hank in a fine gray suit. As it was our wedding day, we treated ourselves to a ride on the streetcar, the number 25 to Dam Square. All the while my mind was only on one thing, the big X and the cancellation in my passport. I could not relax, and neither could Hank. I knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, even if I was turned over to the Germans to be deported, or worse, I would never go back to Vienna. Never. It was impossible. I would go directly into hiding. I would never go back to Austria. Because Margot was sick, Mrs. Frank stayed home to take care of her. Anna and Mr. Frank arrived at the City Hall together. Anna looked very grown up with her little princess-style coat and matching cloche hat with a ribbon around the brim. Our friends were all nervous as cats as we waited. They all knew how perilous the situation was. Anna's eyes flickered nervously back and forth from Hank to me. Perhaps we were the first romantic bride and groom she had ever seen in the flesh. I could see as she looked at Hank that she thought of him as a gallant, dashing figure. A wedding was the number one romantic occasion for a girl of 12. Finally, our names were called. Hank and I stepped forward toward the desk. Our friends pressed in behind us like a wall. Clerk reached out his hand and asked for the official certificate. Hank handed it to him. The clerk glanced at it, made a notation, looked up, and asked me for my passport. A great fist grabbed hold of my heart and squeezed. This was the terrible moment. I knew it. Hank knew it. Our friends knew it too. There was absolute silence. I'd been holding my passport so tightly it was stuck to my hand. I unstuck it and handed it over. The official opened the passport and thumbed through the pages. But all the while his eyes were on Hank, not on me, not on the passport. Without looking down at it, he said, "It's all right." My head roared as our little group moved into the next room where the official ceremony was to take place. I heard nothing but the thumping of a delicious drum in my mind. It beat, "I'm Dutch, I'm Dutch, I'm Dutch," with a glorious boom. Because times were hard, Hank and I had barely scraped together enough money for one gold ring. He had insisted that I should wear it. We agreed that later we'd buy another ring for Hank to wear. For the time being, one would do. All summer a rash of anti-Jewish edicts were published, one after another. First, on June the 3rd, 1941, it was ordered that a large black J was to be added to the identity cards of all persons who had registered during the census as having 2 or more Jewish grandparents. When the J's were ordered, a penalty was established. Any Jews who failed to register would be imprisoned for 5 years and also would have all their property confiscated. Some of the anti-Jewish orders seemed ridiculous. Jews were no longer allowed to keep pigeons, but others were devastating. Jewish bank deposits and valuables were suddenly frozen from transfer or use. A slow strangulation was taking place, first isolation and now impoverization. In September 1941, Anna and Margot began to attend the Jewish secondary school. Lashing adults with the brutal whip of hate was one thing. We'd seen that these Nazis were entirely capable of that. But to hurt defenseless children was even worse. Autumn came, and the days began to shorten. The Germans had invaded Russia that June, and they continued to sweep that vast country as though nothing could stop them. So far, the edicts that had been squeezing Jews out of various professions and businesses hadn't touched Mr. Frank or Mr. von Dahn. What Mr. Frank had done with his savings and valuables when the banking edicts had been issued had not been discussed with us, naturally. He was always himself, never missed work, never complained, and kept his private life at home. Like ripples on a pond, the effects of the German persecution of the Jewish population seemed to be widening and deepening. None of us knew what was yet to come. Being Jewish had to feel these days as though one were standing on shifting sands, and for some, quicksand. Mr. Frank was a shrewd man. Whatever his thoughts and perceptions about his personal position as a Jew, I knew he would be clever. And so one day he told Hank that he had some personal business to discuss with him. He and Hank went into Mr. Frank's private office. Mr. Frank explained to Hank that his position in the company was creating a danger for everyone. He explained that he had thought it through very carefully and had decided that he would resign as managing director of Travis and Company. The corporate papers would be legally changed. In his place, his good friend Mr. Copehaus would be substituted. Mr. Frank would remain in the capacity of advisor, but in reality would continue to run the business as usual. The only real change would be from the legal standpoint. Mr. Frank explained further that another trusted Christian figurehead in the business would be, he believed, a further strengthening of the Christian look of the company. Would Hank consider becoming director of Pecticon, the spice company, with Mr. Kraler as managing director? Hank was delighted that his old Dutch Christian name could lend a protective front to Mr. Frank's firm. Life on the Prinsengracht continued, of course, without a pause. Mr. Frank came to work every day. He sat at his desk in his private office and made all the decisions and gave all the orders. Nothing changed, except that when a check had been made out or a letter had been typed, Mr. Frank would pass whatever it was that needed signing over for a totally Christian signature. In December of 1941, our spirits rose with news from the BBC. It was almost unbelievable. That great country, America, was now with us in this fight against Hitler. The Germans began rationing our food. Special stamp cards with signatures were issued to each of us to go along with our ration cards. Each period of 4 weeks or 8 weeks, we would receive a new ration coupon, and our stamp cards would be signed by the official in charge. In the newspapers were lists of what could be bought against which coupon. As more and more Jews were banned from their jobs, the Germans began organizing labor camps for unemployed Jewish men. The labor assignments were often to the east. No one really knew where. Poland? Czechoslovakia? The whispers said that those who refused, when they were called up for labor, would be sent to Mauthausen to receive harsh punishment. If one obeyed and went when ordered, it was said that one would have to work very hard, perhaps, and receive very small wages, but decent treatment was promised. Jews were no longer allowed to marry non-Jews. Jews could no longer ride on streetcars. Jews had to shop only at certain hours and at certain shops. Jews couldn't sit in their own gardens, or at cafes, or in public gardens in order to get some fresh air. Our Saturday afternoon get-togethers at the Franks had stopped. So had the occasional dinner Hank and I had attended with the Franks and their girls. These laws were succeeding in isolating and separating our Jewish friends from the rest of us. Everywhere now in our neighborhood there were anxious-faced Jews getting poorer and poorer daily, many scratching around for ways to feed their children. I felt an ache for these demoralized people whenever I saw them. In the spring of 1942 came yet another edict. This one was printed in the Dutch newspaper, not just in the Jewish Weekly. From 1 week hence, all Jews were ordered to sew a yellow 6-pointed star the size of an adult's palm onto their clothing above the heart. This meant all men, women, and children. Each star cost a clothing coupon from the ration book and 4 cents. On the yellow star was printed, Jod, Jew. A threat was delivered to the population at large. Anyone assisting Jews in any way would be sent to prison and possibly executed. Mr. Frank came to the office as usual. No mention was made of the yellow star affixed by neat stitches to his coat. We looked through it as though it were not there. To me, it was not. One morning, after the coffee cups were gathered up and washed, Mr. Frank called me into his private office. He closed the door. He locked eyes with me, his soft brown eyes looking deeply into mine with an almost piercing directness. "Miep," he began, "I have a secret to confide to you." He continued, "Edith, Margot, Anna, and I are planning to go underground, to go into hiding." He let me take this in. "We will go together with Van Daan and his wife and their son. I'm sure you know the empty rooms in the back of the office. That is where we will hide. As you will be working on as usual right next to us, I need to know if you have any objections." I told him I did not. "Miep, are you willing to take on the responsibility of taking care of us while we are in hiding?" There is a look between two people once or twice in a lifetime that cannot possibly be described by words. That look passed between us. "Miep, for those who help Jews, the punishment is harsh. Imprisonment, perhaps." I cut him off. I said, "Of course." I meant it. "Good. Only Kophaus knows. Even Margot and Anna do not know yet. One by one I will ask the others, but only a few will know." I asked no further questions. The less I knew, the less I could say in an interrogation. I knew when the time was right, he would tell me who the others were, and everything else I would need to know. I felt no curiosity. I had given my word. As the second anniversary of the German occupation grew close in the spring of 1942, Hitler's might was not lessening. All our hopes rested with the Allies, our allies. Our lives had totally changed. At the last of the day, as though we'd been doing it all our lives, up went the blackout frames. We were getting used to queuing up at almost every shop and always buying a little extra if it happened to be available, just in case. Jews bore the most anxiety. Their freedoms had been snatched away one by one, their jobs, their mobility. Because of the Yellow Star, Jews were suddenly conspicuous. When a child who had never met a Jew came into contact with one, the child would be surprised that he didn't have horns or vampire teeth, that he looked like the rest of us instead of like a devil, as the Germans said he did. Our children's minds were being poisoned. Nightly, the drone of bombers overhead interfered with our sleep. In our neighborhood, there was no shelter, so Hank and I got used to the warnings and paid them no mind. We'd just pull the blankets a little higher and snuggle a little closer to each other, deep in the soft bedding. Suddenly one day, Mr. von Dahn came to me in my office and told me to come with him. He led the way down the Prinsengracht, over the bridge to the Rosengracht, and onto a small side street. There he led us to a butcher's shop and motioned for me to follow him inside. It was strange for Herman von Dahn to do such a thing, but I followed him. I stood quietly beside him as he and the butcher engaged in conversation. I could see that they were on friendly terms. Finally, he purchased a small quantity of meat and had it wrapped in brown paper to take home to his wife. I said nothing, he said nothing, and we returned to the office. Several times in the next months, Mr. von Dahn would ask me to come with him to this same butcher shop. I did as he asked, but I always wondered why he didn't just shop near home. Each time he'd engage in joking, friendly talk with the butcher and purchase some small cut of meat, and I'd always stand quietly aside until he turned to me and motioned that he was ready to go back to the office. I hoped that Mr. von Dahn would explain himself to me at some later date. Meanwhile, the oppression of the Jews continued unabated. They now had to be in their own homes from 8 at night until 6 in the morning. And under no circumstances were Jews to visit homes or gardens or other accommodations that belonged to Christian people. And then, the lowest trick of all. Bicycles belonging to Jews were to be handed in to the Germans by a certain date in June. Nothing worse could happen to a Dutch person than taking away his bicycle. Now, how could a Jew get from place to place? How could he get to work if he still had work? How could young people like Margot and Otto Frank get along without their black Dutch bicycles? It was the first Sunday in July, a warm summer night, when there came an insistent ringing of our bell. Tension rose in the apartment at the sound. Quickly, Hank went to the door and I followed him. There stood Herman von Dahn in quite an agitated condition. "Come right away," he said. "Margot Frank has received a postcard ordering her to appear for forced labor shipment to Germany. The Franks have decided to go immediately into hiding. Can you come right now to take a few things that they'll need?" We put on our raincoats. To be seen carrying bags and packages would be too dangerous. We would hide much under our baggy old raincoats. Walking quickly but not hurrying in order to not attract attention, we went toward the Mervedeplein. I suddenly felt a great sense of urgency for my friends. Conscripting a 16-year-old girl for forced labor was a new abomination the Germans were inflicting on the Jews. When we arrived at the Frank apartment, few words were exchanged. I could feel their urgency, an undercurrent of near panic. Mrs. Frank handed us piles of what felt like children's clothes and shoes. I just took and took as much as I could, hiding the bunches of things the best way I could. With our coats bursting, Hank and I made our way back to our rooms and quickly unloaded what we'd had under our coats. We put it all under our bed. Then, our coats empty again, we hurried back to the Mervedeplein to get another load. Anna came in bringing too many things. Her eyes were like saucers, a mixture of excitement and terrible fright. Hank and I took as much as we could and quickly left. Early the next day, Monday, I woke to the sound of rain. Before 7:30, as we had arranged the night before, I had ridden my bicycle to the Mervedeplein. No sooner had I reached the front stoop that the door of the Franks' apartment opened and Margot emerged. Her bike was standing outside. Margot had not handed in her bicycle as ordered. Mr. and Mrs. Frank were inside, and Anna, wide-eyed in a nightgown, hung back inside the doorway. I could tell that Margot was wearing layers of clothing. Mr. and Mrs. Frank looked at me. Their eyes pierced mine. Without a backward glance, Margot and I pushed our bicycles onto the street. We pedaled evenly, not too fast, in order to appear like two everyday working girls on their way to work on a Monday morning. All the way, we had not said one word. We both knew that from the moment we'd mounted our bicycles, we'd become criminals. Not a soul was about on the Prinsengracht. We carried our bicycles into the storeroom. I unlocked the door to the office and shut it against the rain. We were soaked through to the skin. I could see that Margot was suddenly on the verge of crumbling. I took her arms and led her past Mr. Frank's office and into the hallway that led to the hiding place. It was approaching the time that the others would be coming to work. I was now afraid that someone would come, but I kept silent. Margot was now like someone stunned, in shock. I could feel her shock now that we were inside. As she opened the door, I gripped her arm for courage. Still, we said nothing. She disappeared behind the door, and I took my place in the front office. My heart, too, was thumping. I sat at my desk wondering how I could get my mind onto my work. The pouring summer rain had been our shelter. Now one person was safe inside the hiding place. 3 more had to be protected by the rain. Mr. Kopers arrived. Soon after, I could hear the warehouseman arriving, stamping water off his shoes. Late in the morning, I heard Mr. and Mrs. Frank and Anna coming through the front office door. All 3 of them were quite wet. They were carrying a few things, and all had yellow stars sewn to their clothes. I opened the door for them and shut it when they had vanished inside. In the afternoon, when no one was around and all was quiet, I went to that door myself and disappeared into the hiding place, closing the door tight behind me. Entering the rooms for the first time, I was surprised by what I saw. In total disorder were sacks and boxes and furnishings, piles of things. I could not imagine how all these things had been brought up to the hiding place. I had not once noticed anything being brought in. Perhaps it had been brought in at night or on Sundays when the office was closed. On this floor there were 2 small rooms. One was rectangular with a window, and the other long and thin, also with a window. The rooms were wood-paneled, the wood painted a dark green, the wallpaper old and yellowish and peeling in places. The windows were covered by thick white makeshift curtains. There was a toilet in a large room, with a dressing area off to the side. Up a steep flight of old wooden steps was a large room with sink and stove and cabinets. Here, too, the windows were covered with curtains. Off this large room was another rickety stairway to an attic and storage area. The steps to the attic cut through a tiny garret-type room, again filled with piles and sacks of things. Mrs. Frank and Margot were like lost people, drained of blood, in conditions of complete lethargy. They appeared as though they couldn't move. Anna and her father were making efforts to create some order out of the multitude of objects, pushing, carrying, clearing. The situation was very upsetting. I wanted to leave the family alone together. I couldn't begin to imagine what they must be feeling to have walked away from everything they had owned in the world. Their home, a lifetime of gathered possessions, Anna's little cat, Murch, keepsakes from the past, and friends. They simply closed the door of their lives and had vanished from Amsterdam. Mrs. Frank's face said it all. Quickly, I left them. When I went up to the hiding place to get the morning shopping list the next day, Anna was full of questions. What about my friends? Have any of them gone into hiding like us? Have they been taken in a razzia? Seeing this hunger, I told them what I knew. I told about the razzias which were taking place in different parts of town. I told them the newest edict was for Jewish telephones to be disconnected, that prices for false identity papers had gone through the ceiling. Faces brightened at the news that yes, Hank would come for a visit also. They longed for each of us to come up as often as possible. Joe Kophaus came often, always bringing a little something. He had a special warm way about him. Mr. Kahler came too, sometimes with questions for Mr. Frank about the business, sometimes with cinema and theater magazines for Anna, who liked news and photos of film stars. Order was slowly being made in the hiding place. Things were being stacked out of the way, up in the attic with the old files from the office. A feeling of home was beginning to emerge, the old trusty coffee pot, children's school books, or a hairbrush lying about. Anna had glued her movie star pictures onto her bedroom wall, Ray Milland, Greta Garbo, Ginger Rogers. Anna and Margot were sharing the long, narrow room on the first floor of the hiding place. Next door, in the bigger room, Mr. and Mrs. Frank had made their bedroom. Upstairs was the living and cooking area, the place to spend the day, as it was one more floor above the office kitchen, and any noise made would be less easily heard. But no noise was made during the day while the workers came and went below. No toilet flushed, no shoes on the creaky wooden stairs. Everyone was still and quiet and waited for one of us to bring the news that the workers below had gone. I noticed that Mrs. Frank continued to be depressed those first days, and Margot had a way of making herself invisible. She never got in the way, she made no demands. Each day, I brought a few of the things that Hank and I had taken from the Mervedeplein the night before they'd gone into hiding. Quickly, I brought everything I had to the hiding place. As the razzias continued, Jews searched frantically for places to hide. Some made desperate, sometimes foolhardy attempts to cross the border to Belgium. Everyone was looking for a safe address. A safe address, a hiding place, had suddenly become the most blessed acquisition. It was better than a job in the diamond trade, more valuable than a pot of gold. 1 week after the Franks had gone into hiding, I went upstairs to get the shopping list as usual, and found that Herman von Dahn, his wife Petronella, and their 16-year-old son had moved into the hiding place. The boy was named Peter. He was a good-looking, stocky boy with thick dark hair, dreamy eyes, and a sweet nature. The new living arrangements in the hiding place were established. Mr. and Mrs. Frank stayed in their bedroom, and Margot and Anna continued to share the long, narrow room off the bathroom and dressing room. Mr. and Mrs. von Dahn were sleeping in the big room 1 flight up from the Franks, and young Peter had taken the tiny room beside his parents, halfway under the stairway that led to the attic. During the day, the von Dahn's bed was folded up against the wall. Their room served as the kitchen and the living room where everyone spent the day. But they stayed off the floor below, which was right above the private offices and the kitchen of the office. Quickly the Franks and the von Dahns were putting things in order, creating quite a cozy home under the circumstances. After the von Dahn's arrival, I began going to both Mrs. Frank and Mrs. von Dahn to ask what I could get for them at the shops. When I did, Mr. von Dahn handed me a list of meat cuts. I read the list and shook my head. Our existing ration coupons could simply not provide so much meat. Mr. von Dahn laughed, his usual cigarette dangling from his lips. "Remember the butcher shop off the Rosengracht where you came with me to shop? Go to this man. Give him my list. Say nothing, and he'll give you what we want. Finally, I understood what those strange visits to the butcher had been about. Most days Henk would come to the Prinsengracht at about noon to have lunch with me in the office. Then he would go upstairs into the hiding place to visit with our friends. Henk would tell whatever news he had, and discussion would begin between the men, and in the same way that my discussions were always with the women. Except for the always curious Anna. Anna was always at the forefront of all the discussions, men's and women's. She was the most curious of all the people in hiding, and the most candid. She greeted all of us visitors with a barrage of questions and inquiries. Now that the Frank family and the Fondane family were in hiding, they could not get ration cards. With the 7 of them to feed, we needed these ration cards desperately. To solve this problem, Henk had made some useful underground connections. These illegal organizations gave Henk stolen or forged ration tickets, which he turned over to me. I kept these tickets with me in the office, using them when I went out on my daily shopping tours for food. Our visits had acquired something of a routine. I, early in the morning, would be the first to visit, the first face after a long night locked in together. But this visit was business only, to get the list for groceries, see what was needed for the day. Then, in the lull of the afternoon, I would bring up the groceries and make a real visit. As Frank and Fondane were the experts in our business, Koophuis and Kraler needed to make many visits upstairs to ask questions and solve business problems. At the end of the day, after the last worker had gone, one of us would come up and let the people in hiding know that they could move about in a normal way, talk normally, not worry about every bit of noise. Everyone, especially Anna, was keen to have us spend a night in the hiding place. I assured them we would come. As the disorder began to be turned into order up in the hiding place, our friends found more and more ways to keep busy during the day. Right away, teamwork had developed between them, and any task was quickly done. All their different personalities were learning to blend, to form a kind of balance. Margot and Peter were quite withdrawn, always part of the background. Mrs. Fondane was temperamental, flirty, chatty. Mrs. Frank, kind and orderly, very quiet, but aware of everything that went on around her. Mr. Fondane was the joke-teller, something of a pessimist, always smoking and somewhat restless. Mr. Frank was the calm one, the children's teacher, the most logical, the one who balanced everyone out. He was the leader, the one in charge. When a decision had to be made, all eyes turned to Mr. Frank. The summer wore on. Through loudspeakers we heard Hitler's voice shrieking out at us about total victory being in sight. Regardless of how much we hated it, we could not argue. Yes, Hitler was holding Europe in his fist and squeezing. All would be lost if Hitler achieved victory before the Americans and British could ready themselves for a landing across the Channel. We could hardly believe that the razzias could get any worse, but in August they did. Often husbands and wives were separated. One was dragged off, the other one left because he or she happened to be elsewhere. When a Jewish home was empty of human beings, a moving company would send a pulsvan around and quickly remove everything until the place was totally bare. Then, often within a matter of days, Dutch Nazis would move into the empty home. August the 6th, 1942, became known as Black Thursday. A razzia lasted throughout the day and into the night. We heard that Jews were picked up in the streets and dragged away. They were taken at gunpoint from their houses, ordered to lock their doors and surrender their keys and walk away from all they had. They were beaten. It was whispered that many Jewish suicides resulted from this razzia. Around this time, Ellie's father, Hans Vossen, came to work for us. One day, soon after he started, I came to work and found that Mr. Frank had taken him into the secret of the hiding plan. To improve its security, Mr. Kraler asked Mr. Vossen to hinge a bookcase to the wall in front of the door to the hiding place. This bookcase, in which we kept empty account books in black and white binding, concealed the door completely. One never would have known there was a door there at all. On the wall above it hung a map of Luxembourg that had been pasted up years before. A hook was placed on the back of the bookcase, which could be fastened by our friends. When opened by them, it would permit the whole bookcase to swing out and away, so that one could enter the hiding place. It was a wonderful idea. Ellie told me later that it was Mr. Frank's idea. Now, suddenly, with so much frightfulness going on outside in the streets of Amsterdam, going into the hiding place was almost like entering the safety and sanctuary of a church. It was secure, and our friends were safe. Every time I pulled the bookcase aside, I had to set a smile on my face and disguise the bitter feeling that burned in my heart. I would take a breath, pull the bookcase closed, and put on an air of calm and good cheer that it was otherwise impossible to feel anywhere in Amsterdam anymore. My friends upstairs were not to be upset, not to be privy to any of my anguish. Jews who had so far avoided arrest were now afraid to go outdoors. Each sound heard was a possible arrival of the green police. Each doorbell, tap on the door, footstep, squeak of a car, a razzia. Many stayed in their homes and just sat, waiting. Mrs. Sampson announced that she would be going into hiding, that she had found a safe address. Hank made a request. Wait until September, that way we can't know anything about your disappearance, and in case we're picked up and they beat us, we can say that we don't know where you went, that we were on vacation then. It was hard to know what was going on. In the official newspaper there was nothing but lies. The Germans described the Jewish deportations as resettlement, and claimed that those taken were being treated decently, given proper food and shelter, that families were being kept together. But at the same time, the BBC claimed that Polish Jews in German prison camps were being gassed, that Dutch Jews were being used for slave labor, and that Dutch Jews had been taken to camps very far from Holland, in Germany and Poland. My head ached with contradictory bits of information. I dreaded to think about the unpleasant rumors that were circulating. For the sake of morale, I had taken to believing only the good news. I passed along all the good news to the hiding place and let the bad go in one ear and out the other. To go on, I had to believe totally that this war would come to a good end for us. The Frank family and the Van Daan family managed to keep healthy throughout the summer. This was of the utmost importance, as the worst fear of all was that someone would get sick and we could not go to a doctor. This anxiety wore on all of us, especially Mrs. Frank. She was particularly careful always for the health of the children. I had started to go to the same vegetable man in his little shop on the Lillegracht. The man had a kind way about him. After several weeks, the man noticed that I always bought large amounts of vegetables. Without words passing between us, he began to put vegetables aside for me. Later on in the day, when it was safe, I'd take the groceries upstairs, except for the heavy potatoes. These were brought by the kind greengrocer during lunchtime. He'd put the heavy load into a small closet I had shown him, and during the night Peter would go down and get the potatoes and bring them up. No words were ever exchanged about this between the greengrocer and me. Nothing needed to be said. I was shopping for 7 people in hiding as well as for Hank and myself. Often I had to go to several shops to get the quantities I needed. Many shopkeepers were not so strict about coupons. Often, if I had a coupon for, say, 2 pounds of potatoes and I wanted 3 pounds, I'd give the coupons and a little bit of money, and they'd gladly give me the extra pound. Much canned and dry food had somehow been secreted up into the hiding place. Sack after sack of dried beans, preserves, soap, linens, and cooking utensils had been brought at strange times in the evening before they went into hiding. Mr. Frank was the supervisor of the children's studies up in the hiding place. Rigorous studying was expected. Assignments were corrected by Mr. Frank. He would have made a wonderful teacher. He was kind and firm and always included a little bit of humor with his lessons. The children's studies took great chunks of time each day. For Margot it was easy. For Anna, although she didn't concentrate as hard as Margot, it was easy too. Anna was often writing in a little orange-checked cloth-bound diary that her father had given her for her 13th birthday on June the 12th, several weeks before the Franks had come into hiding. She wrote in her diary in 2 places, her own room or her parents' room. Although everyone knew that she was writing, she never wrote when other people were present. Obviously, Mr. Frank had spoken about this matter and given instructions for no one to disturb her. As I heard from Mr. Frank, the diary was a constant companion for Anna, and also a source of teasing by others. She would tease right back, always quick with a reply, but to be safe, she kept her diary in her father's old leather briefcase. Anna and the others had been after us to come and sleep upstairs in the hiding place. When I announced to Anna and Mrs. Frank that we would finally come to spend the night, the enthusiasm was extraordinary. You'd have thought that Queen Wilhelmina herself was about to make a visit. Rubbing her hands together, Anna was filled with excitement. After work, the door of the building was locked. We made sure that everyone was gone and the lights had been turned off. Then we went to the landing near the back office, pulled open the bookcase and went in. I closed it behind us. Anna directed us toward the bedroom she shared with Margot. At Anna's insistence, Hank and I had been allotted their room. Anna and Margot were going into the room with their parents for the night. Amused, I told her that I'd be honored, and put my night things on her bed and Hank's on Margot's bed. Shortly, it was time for the radio broadcasts, and the entire group trooped down to Mr. Frank's office below to pull up chairs and gather around the Philips radio on the table. The whole room bristled with excitement when the near and yet so far voice of Radio Orange was heard, filling us with hope and with information, our only real connection to the still free outside world. With the blackout frames up and the electric light on along with the heat from the cooking, the room became toasty warm, cozy. We sat long over coffee and dessert, talking, our friends devouring the novelty of our presence. They seemed to be insatiable for our company. As I sat, I became aware of what it meant to be imprisoned in these small rooms. As this feeling registered, I felt a taste of the helpless fear that these people were filled with, day and night. Yes, for all of us it was wartime, but Hank and I had the freedom to come and go as we pleased, to stay in or go out. These people were in a prison with locks inside the doors. Reluctantly, we said good nights, and Hank and I and the Frank family trooped down the stairway to the floor below. I climbed into Anna's hard little bed, which was very toasty with many blankets. The room was cool, and as I settled in as cozily as I could hear every sound being made in the other rooms. The Westertoren clock struck at 15-minute intervals. I'd never heard it so loud. It echoed and reverberated through the rooms. I never slept. I couldn't close my eyes. I heard the sound of a rainstorm begin, the wind come up. The quietness of the place was overwhelming. The fright of these people who were locked up here was so thick I could feel it pressing down on me. It was like a thread of terror pulled taut. It was so terrible that it never let me close my eyes. For the first time, I knew what it was like to be a Jew in hiding. It was a rainy and chilly autumn in Holland, and always gloomy. Radio Orange told us of the rains in Russia that were slowing down the German Sixth Army, and that the English and Americans, led by General Eisenhower, had landed November the 8th on the Moroccan and Algerian shores. The BBC gave us more hopeful news. Slowly, yes, but inch by inch. Despite the lull in Jewish persecution, Jews felt no sense of safety. Although many were long gone, others still lived in dread, usually with no source of livelihood unless working in one of the ever-decreasing protected trades. It had been illegal for quite some time for a Christian to utilize the services of a Jew in the medical and dental professions, but I refused to discontinue being treated by Albert Dussel. He was an excellent dentist, and he was a man I liked. During a routine visit to his office, he asked in a quiet, guarded voice if I knew of a hiding place. That autumn, Dr. Dussel joined the others in the Annex. Mr. Frank had said, where 7 can eat, 8 people can eat as well. When I pushed Dr. Dussel up the old stairway leading to the landing where the bookcase stood in front of the hiding place, coffee was ready and a bottle of cognac. Dussel looked as if he were going to keel over. Seeing Mr. Frank was like seeing a ghost, because he thought that the Franks had escaped to Switzerland. Who could have imagined that they were right in the center of Amsterdam? When Dussel came, Margot was moved into the room with Mr. and Mrs. Frank. Anna stayed where she was, now sharing her narrow room with Dr. Dussel. Everyone seemed very good-natured about the new arrangements, but the place had become rather cramped with 8 instead of 7. As 1942 drew towards its end, I became aware of a kind of flagging energy up in the Annex. It wasn't easy to put one's finger on it, but it was as though some of the spirit had gone out of the people upstairs, and a kind of languor had taken over. I could see that Dussel's stuffy ways were getting on Anna's nerves, that Anna's capriciousness was irritating Dussel. The friendliness between Mrs. Frank and Mrs. von Dahn had turned a bit starchy. Peter was more than ever up in the attic, and Margot could sit in one place endlessly. Little irritating accidents and sicknesses were also occurring, but nothing dangerous. It was to be expected. It seemed as though these little ills were a small price to pay for a safe oasis from the dismal life in German-occupied Amsterdam. We guessed that a large percentage of the Jewish population was no longer in Amsterdam, but had been deported to the east. Ellie and I began to plan to make a festive St. Nicholas Day for the hiding place. Although the Franks were Jewish, we knew that they were liberal about religious practice. All over the Netherlands, St. Nicholas Day, December the 5th, is more a day for children than a day of religious observance. We had in mind a day of festivity for Margot, Anna, and Peter. Ellie and I worked arduously over the rhyming, somewhat teasing little poems that are the essence of St. Nicholas Day. Together we racked our imaginations for little gifts that suited each member of the group in hiding. Since it was impossible to buy things in the shops, we were forced to use lots of ingenuity and do-it-yourself homemade ideas. In secret, we sewed, hammered, glued. Then we gathered all the little tokens and the poems and hid them in a big basket which we first covered in decorations that Ellie had brought from home, leftovers from St. Nicholas celebrations in years past. We hid the colorful basket until the appointed hour, when Mr. Frank could lead the entire group down the stairway for the surprise. Thinking about Anna, I recalled how I had recently noticed how pale and pasty her coloring had become. The others, too. Not a ray of sun or breath of fresh air had touched their skin in more than 6 months. I wondered how many times a Nazi had walked by Prinsengracht 263, never knowing, never suspecting. Better to think good thoughts, how happy the children would be to come downstairs and find the basket of gifts and poems. Tomorrow Anna would recount to me every detail of the festivity. Together we could laugh and relive it. We were all sure the war would be over in 1943. The weather was abysmal, dark, dank. People had been living under so much pressure that some had begun to crack. Hank and I, all of us, followed the Battle of Stalingrad. The word surrender was being used for the first time over the BBC. The Germans were on the verge of surrender. We dared to hope, but no one could ever imagine the word surrender coming out of Hitler's mouth. But surrender they did on February the 2nd. What glee we felt! We hoped it was the beginning of the end. As the winter dragged on, none of us went very far from our coal fires. We all did our best to warm ourselves, to keep heat in. The small size of the rooms in the hiding place helped. Everything that could be burned was tossed into the little stove. One morning, we arrived for work to find all our friends in a state. Noises had been heard the night before, and they suspected a robbery had occurred down in the warehouse. They were afraid that whoever had been breaking into the warehouse had been alerted by the sound of their footsteps. There was particular concern that the radio in Mr. Frank's old office had been carelessly left dialed to the BBC station, a criminal offense. The chairs in the office were pulled up to the radio as well, creating a picture of a group that had been intently listening to the news. They were terrified that the thief would go and report the situation to the police, and the police would put two and two together and make a raid on the hiding place. When the warehouse was explored, no signs of break-in or anything unusual could be found. I realized that our friends in the Annex were having an infectious case of nerves. April finally arrived. It was the season for spring cleaning, but even that was curtailed by the war. Soap was becoming more and more scarce. Thread and cloth were becoming more and more expensive. I had to think twice, 3 times, before I patched the toe of Hank's socks. Could the piece of thread be used for something more necessary? Did our friends need it more than we did? The children's clothes were starting to fall apart, to fray, and simply wear out. Most in need and most obvious was little Anna, who was turning into not-so-little Anna before our very eyes. She was simply bursting out of her clothes, and her body was changing shape as well. Her feet could no longer be squeezed into the shoes she'd brought into the hiding place. It made me laugh when she tried, but inside I could have cried at the sight of those tender, growing feet that should have been running, dancing, and swimming. This growth spurt was right on schedule. Anna would turn 14 on June the 12th. Nature was moving her right along despite the conditions forced upon her. We went all out to make her birthday as festive as we could. Little sweets and goodies, books, blank paper, second-hand things. Anna always showed the most joy and happiness when receiving or giving gifts and celebrating almost anything. This year, she was especially pleased with everything we had gathered for her. Shortly afterward, during another big raid on Germany, there was very heavy anti-aircraft fire. One plane was hit and crashed near the Miep plain, quite close to the hiding place. A terrible explosion occurred, and large fires could be seen burning. In the Annex, there was near panic because of the plane crash. They lived constantly with the feeling that they were about to be bombed or burned or crashed upon. Not only did these bombings remind them of their total vulnerability, but after several more imagined robberies in the offices, an actual robbery finally took place. It wasn't much to speak of. The thieves had taken mostly ration coupons for sugar, our petty cash box, and several little odds and ends, but worst of all, and shattering to our friend's sense of well-being, was the fact that these scoundrels had broken right through the fortress of the door to the front office. This time, no one in hiding had had any inkling that the intruders were wandering just below. No one had been making any effort to be silent. Water might have been running, feet hurrying up the creaky stairway. Voices calling out upstairs might have been heard. It was brought home to our friends that their safe fortress was not so safe. During these terrible times, The thieves could easily go to the police and report the presence of people in hiding. The Germans were paying a reward for each Jew in hiding who was found. The times were such that a thief was safe and a Jew was not. Suddenly, good news brought us all a tremendous feeling of hope. Mussolini's regime had crumbled. Our friends in hiding were euphoric. Mr. Frank and Anna were the most optimistic that the war would be over very soon. One particularly harried morning, when I had quite a load on my bike and was trying to finish my shopping, I was just about to make a turn when a careless motorcycle with a sidecar carrying 2 German soldiers collided with my bike. I jumped off before I fell. Something boiled over inside of me. It was unlike me to lose my temper, but the words angrily shot out of my mouth. "You contemptible, vile men," I exploded, and was immediately aware that Dutchmen had been shot for much less. But I felt no concern for consequences, just fed up to my brim with these oppressors. I was standing, straddling my bicycle, shouting at the soldiers. The driver stopped the motorbike just ahead and turned and looked at me. The motor was making so much noise as I shouted that, afterward, when I'd come to my senses, it occurred to me that they might not have understood me. Both German soldiers turned and gave a laugh and rode away. My heart was beating furiously as I realized what I had done. Late that afternoon, bringing up a little parcel and a book, both for Dr. Düssel, I related the story of the German motorcycle to the hiding place. Everyone became agitated by the danger of my encounter. Later I heard from Mr. Frank that the parcel I had brought was a highly illegal anti-Nazi book. The punishment for possessing that book was imprisonment or death. Anna was highly indignant. "When Miep is in danger, all of us are in danger," she scolded. Once when I was in the hiding place, Anna began to try on her clothes, imagining what she would wear back to school. She chattered a mile a minute, and we all smiled at the sight of her wrists and hands sticking out from stretched sweaters reached only to her mid-forearm. Forget buttons. Her shape had changed so much that it was impossible even to try to make buttons meet. Anna made it like a comedy to cover her frustration. Anna was spontaneous and still childish sometimes, but she had gradually acquired a new coyness, a new maturity. She had arrived a girl, but she would leave a woman. An understanding had developed between Anna and me. Sometimes, without words, I would sense how she felt or what she wanted, as one woman to another. We had developed this kind of silent language as twice a day, day after day, week after week, I had been trying to satisfy her needs. I felt a particular kinship with Anna, turning this important corner of her life and caught in these terrifying times. How much pretty things meant to young ladies of 14 who were just beginning to feel pretty themselves. And, sadly, pretty things were the last thing we could come by. I became determined to find something grown-up and pretty for Anna in the course of my searches. One day I stumbled onto just the right thing. I had found a pair of high-heeled red leather pumps. They were second-hand, but in good condition. I hesitated about the size, how awful if they didn't fit her. But then I thought, buy, take a chance. I brought them up to the hiding place behind my back. I went to Anna and stuck them in front of her. Never have I seen anyone so happy as Anna was that day. And quick, on went the shoes, and they fitted just right. She got very quiet then. She had never felt herself on high heels before. She wobbled slightly, but with determination. Chewing on her upper lip, she walked across the room and back and then did it again, just walking back and forth, up and back, more and more steadily each time. During the late summer and fall of 1943, the Germans had begun to round up non-Jewish Dutchmen between the ages of 16 and 40. These men were being shipped to Germany for, as they called it, labor service. This added a new element of tension to our life. Henk was 38 and healthy and fit as anyone could be during these times. One night, when we were both home from our offices, exhausted, as we were every night, Hank told me that he had something quite important to talk with me about. I sat quietly and listened. A colleague whom he knew very well asked outright if he was willing to work with a resistance group that had been organized in the office. The work was illegal and quite dangerous. Of the approximately 250 men working in their department, perhaps 8 had been asked to join. Immediately Hank had said yes. I listened, not wanting Hank to see the hard lump that had risen in my throat as he talked. I waited for Hank to give me details of his dangerous new work, but he didn't. I couldn't help showing how worried I now was, simply as a wife, that something would happen to him. But as a fellow resistor, I was happy that he'd found a new way to go against our oppressors. He begged me not to worry and told me, if I don't come home one night, then wait for a message to be sent to you. We agreed that it was best to say nothing about this dangerous secret work to our friends in hiding. Hank didn't want to tell me any more either at that time, so I asked nothing. Nonetheless, a strange feeling gnawed at me, and I caught myself inquiring, Hank, how long have you been doing this work? Maybe half a year, he replied. I didn't want to tell you, because I didn't want you to worry. As the second winter approached, Mrs. Frank began to act oddly. When I left the hiding place, she would follow me downstairs just as far as she could go, to the back side of the bookcase, in fact. It was as if she were escorting me out, but then, rather than bid me goodbye, she'd just stand there and look at me, with an expression of wanting in her eyes. I'd stand and wait for her to say what it was that she wanted of me, but she wouldn't say a word, just stand there awkwardly. I began to feel very uncomfortable, standing face to face with her. It took a while, but finally I realized that what she wanted was to be able to talk with me in a confidential way when no one else was around. So I began to leave myself some extra time and would go with Mrs. Frank to the bedroom that she and her husband shared with Margot. She and I would sit on the edge of her bed, and I would listen while she talked. What she needed to talk about, which she couldn't talk about in front of the others, was that she was suffering under a great weight of despair. Although the others were counting the days until the Allies came, making games of what they would do when the war was all over, Mrs. Frank confessed that she was deeply ashamed of the fact that she felt the end would never come. Sometimes she would complain about Mrs. von Dahn, who was always impatient with her girls, especially Anna. This was something no one else had ever done about anyone in the Annex for my ears. If there were tensions and conflicts, they were never aired when one of us was visiting the hiding place. She desperately needed to talk about some of these things. I would listen with a sympathetic ear to whatever Mrs. Frank needed to say, and then, when I could stay no longer, I would have to break into the talk because some chore or other was waiting. I would promise that we would talk again next time. I would leave her sitting in that room, wearing a look of gloom and depression. By winter of 1943, it seemed as if all the Jews in Amsterdam were gone. Either they had been deported, or they were in hiding, or had somehow fled. I dreaded to think about what had become of these people. So many unpleasant rumors circulated. About the only way a Jew was seen now was floating face down in a canal. Sometimes Jews were thrown there by the very people who had hidden them. For one of the worst situations that could arise for us helpers was if someone in hiding died. What to do with the body? It was a terrible dilemma, as a Jew could not properly be buried. That winter was especially cold and stormy. It was always a fight with stinging rain and slippery streets and longer searches for food. The scarcities grew worse with each passing day. I could not relax my vigilance in my searches. Too many of us had to eat. Because I was a lifeline, I felt myself to be a kind of hunter, ever hunting for my always hungry brood. but slowly I was turning into an unrelenting scavenger and would make do even with scraps. I could not allow myself to get sick. I could not allow myself a holiday. During this period, a gloomy mood had settled over the hiding place. I tried to think of what might lend a little cheer as the holiday season approached. I began to put aside any sweets that I could find, since in my mind nothing cheered us up better than sweets. I scrounged up bits of butter and flour, careful not to let it be known that I was planning to bake a real cake. The last days of the year approached, dark, short, and gloomy in occupied Amsterdam. The Allied bombings of Germany were ever increasing, so that the drone of aircraft was constantly in our ears at night. Koophuis, Ellie, Carla, Henk, and I planned our surprise for a Friday night before New Year's Eve, when we would all remain after the workers had gone and present our friends with what each of us had scrounged up for them. When Henk arrived from his office, we each carried our offerings up the steep stairway. Each of us had come up with some goodies, and I'd baked my special spice cake, Anna's favorite. The sight of our parade was like an elixir of pleasure. Before us, 8 mouths began to salivate. Anna noticed the message that I'd carved into the top of the cake and called it to everyone's attention. With black market beer and imitation coffee, we all paused to toast the message, Peace in 1944. In recent months, bit by bit, Henk had told me more about his resistance activities. There were men and women who were in danger and had to go under to take the pressure off. They were people just like us. They could have been us. It was Henk's job in the resistance to visit these illegal people by using passwords and special lists. He would assess their needs and then supply, through the organization, whatever they most needed. Ration cards, money. Since Henk was a social worker for the city of Amsterdam, a caseworker who'd visited people in need, he had a perfect cover for his activities. In February 1944, I turned 35, but more important was Margot's birthday one day later. She was 18, and she needed the special attention. Never did we forget any birthday. In the hiding place on the day of my birthday, Mrs. Van Daan unexpectedly took me aside, asking me to come out into the hallway near the stairs. I braced myself to receive some grim news, but instead she looked into my eyes and said, "Miep, Hermine and I have been wanting to find a way to express the inexpressible. But there are no words. This is just a small token of our appreciation and friendship. Here." She thrust a small package into my hands. "Open it." I started to say that it wasn't necessary, but she nudged me. "Open it." I did. Inside was a ring, the setting a diamond-shaped piece of black onyx with a twinkling diamond set in the center, a beautiful antique ring. I immediately wanted to protest, thinking how many cigarettes and sausages this beautiful ring would fetch on the black market for the Van Daans, who were now dipping into their possessions, selling off everything they could through Mr. Koophuis. Some firm, invisible hand pressed against my lips, keeping me silenced. Instead of being practical, I looked back into Mrs. Van Daan's dark eyes and promised, "I'll wear it always, in friendship," and slipped it on my index finger. It fit perfectly. Mrs. Van Daan put her hand on my shoulder for an instant and squeezed, and then we went our separate ways. March came at last, signaling the approaching end of the cold and dark days. For more reasons than ever before, we prepared to welcome spring. Coal shortages were everywhere, and sometimes even the electricity would go off for short periods of time. Henk discovered that the people who had been providing the illegal ration coupons for our friends in hiding had been caught. Suddenly, this lifeline was cut. Through his other underground activities, Henk managed to obtain 5 new ration cards. But 5 ration cards would be so little to try to feed 8. Henk promised to try to make better arrangements. Those in hiding took the news well, but naturally, they were fearful. The bursting forth of spring meant everything to us. Up at the hiding place, Anna would take me to the curtained window, the curtains now very soiled. She would point out each new burst of green on the great chestnut tree behind the annex. What an elegant tree it was, ablaze with rich green buds. Anna studied the progress of the buds each day, explaining to me how much bigger they were and how quickly they were ripening. She also reminded me of how happy I had been that day of my wedding, when the ceremony had been completed and I was, finally, safely Dutch. I want to be Dutch, too, Anna confided. When it's over, I promised, you can become whatever you like. One morning, in a little less of a hurry than usual, I went about my normal chores. The air was balmy, though still chilly. Clouds billowed across the sky, thick and lazy. I came to our vegetable shop on the Lillegracht. I waited with several other shoppers, trying to get a look inside to see what it had to sell. Finally, my turn came, and rather than finding the man who'd given me extra quantities of vegetables, I found his wife. She looked distraught. I asked her what was the matter. She whispered to me that her husband had been arrested and taken away for hiding 2 Jews. My heart pounded. When one was taken away, means were employed to get that person to tell what he or she knew about others. Quickly, I purchased less than I needed and left. I thought about this kind man who'd always given extra to me, who had, in fact, delivered heavy sacks of potatoes to the Prinsengracht. He must have known that I was feeding people in hiding, but he had never spoken about it. What might he say to the Gestapo when they did terrible things to him to make him tell what he knew about others? Would he tell about me? All the time now we were counting the days of good weather, knowing that our allies would need good weather in order to make the landing we'd been expecting. In May, we counted many days of good weather, and still the landing didn't come. A fervent excitement had been building in our friends. It was as though all would be well when the Allied invasion touched the continent, wherever it might be. Our friends argued constantly with Henk and with each other over where they thought the landing would take place. And then it happened. The landing had begun in Normandy. On June the 6th, early in the morning, the news came over the BBC. People were animated as they hadn't been in years. When I went up into the annex, it was as if an electric current were running through the place. Everyone was glued to the radio, waiting for more and more information. The American General Eisenhower was going to speak later. Henk ran upstairs at lunchtime, his cheeks pink with excitement. We gathered around the radio waiting for the American general to speak. For the first time, we all heard the flat American voice of General Eisenhower. As we wiped tears from our eyes, he assured us that total victory over the Germans would be coming within this very year, 1944. Daily, the pins in the map Mr. Frank had stuck up onto the wall moved closer to Holland. Anna turned 15 in June. For this birthday, Ellie and I put together a nice little bunch of blank copybooks for her exercises and diary keeping, and I searched out some sweets on the black market for Anna's sweet tooth. One beautiful hot day that July, I finished my work early. The office was very quiet, almost sleepy. I decided to pay an unexpected visit to the hiding place. I thought I'd just go upstairs and talk with whoever wanted to chat. Visits made the time go faster for the people in hiding. I climbed the steep steps, and by passing Mr. and Mrs. Frank's bedroom, I saw Anna alone over by the curtained window. I went in. I saw that she was writing intently and hadn't heard me. I was quite close to her and was about to turn and go when she looked up, surprised, and saw me standing there. In our many encounters over the years, I'd seen Anna, like a chameleon, go from mood to mood, but always with friendliness. She'd never been anything but effusive, admiring, and adoring with me. But I saw a look on her face at this moment that I'd never seen before. It was a look of dark concentration, as if she had a throbbing headache. This look pierced me, and I was speechless. She was suddenly another person there, writing at the table. Mrs. Frank must have heard me come in, and I heard her soft step behind me. I could tell from the sound of her voice when she finally spoke that she'd summed up the situation. She spoke in German, which she used only when a situation was difficult. Her voice was ironic, yet kind as she told me, "Yes, Miep, as you know, we have a daughter who writes." At this, Anna stood up. She shut the book she was writing in, and with that look still on her face, she said in a dark voice that I'd also never heard before, "Yes, and I write about you, too." I turned and went away. I was upset by Anna's dark mood. I knew that more and more her diary had become her life. It was as if I had interrupted an intimate moment in a very, very private friendship. I went back downstairs to the office, feeling distressed, and thinking all the rest of the day, it wasn't Anna up there. She was so upset by my interruption. It was another person. Hitler's voice on the radio had become even more hysterical, his words often not making much sense. It was obvious to us all that he was trying to breathe new fury into his retreating troops. His voice had become that of a desperate fanatic rather than that of a leader of armies and men. But despite the approach of the Allies, life in Amsterdam got worse. Sometimes I'd sit at my desk in the office tapping the end of my pencil on the window ledge and staring into the canal below. Although there was work in front of me, I couldn't concentrate. I'd think, my God, what else can I do that I'm not doing? What's going to happen? Worst of all, when I felt particularly weak, there was no one I could talk to about my insecurities. Naturally, I couldn't speak of them to those closest to me, Mr. and Mrs. Frank. I could not even speak of them to Hank. Hank was doing his own illegal work, and I couldn't burden him further. If I'd had a particularly bad day, I'd come home exhausted. Sometimes I could see that Hank, too, had totally worn himself out. Neither of us would complain to the other. Instead, I'd cook the best dinner I could put together. Sometimes Hank and I, in spite of the curfew, would go to our friends across the street. Together, we'd listen to the Dutch news from London. Radio Orange told us that General Bradley's U.S. 12th Army Group had smashed the German front. Later, it reported that General Patton's Third Army had taken Avranches. It seemed that the whole Western Front had been ripped apart and that the German resistance was near collapse. News like this was my strong medicine. Lying in my bed, I could hear the English bombers flying toward Germany by night and the anti-aircraft explosions. By day, off in the distance, we heard the drone of the American bombers going in the same direction. Hearing them, I'd start to feel my strength come back. At night, Radio Orange would tell us where those bombers had struck: Hamburg, Berlin, Stuttgart, Essen, and what kind of damage they had inflicted. I could only hope that the end of this awful war was growing closer. It was just an ordinary Friday morning, August the 4th, 1944. First thing in the morning, I'd gone into the hiding place to get the shopping list. Anna, as usual, had many questions to ask and urged me to talk a little. I promised to make a long, cozy visit in the afternoon when I returned with the groceries. I went back to the office and got started with my work. Sometime between 11 and 12 o'clock, I looked up. There in the doorway stood a man in civilian clothes. I hadn't heard the door. He was holding a revolver, pointing it at us. He came in. "Stay put," he said in Dutch. "Don't move." He walked to the back of the office where Kalle was working, leaving Ellie, Mr. Koophuis, and I alone. We were petrified. I quickly took the illegal ration cards, the money, and Hank's lunch out of my bag. Then I waited until I heard the familiar sound of Hank's footsteps on the stairs. Before he could come inside, I jumped up, ran to the door, shoved everything into his hands, and said, "Hank, it's wrong here. He understood me immediately and disappeared. I went back to my desk where the man with the gun had told me to stay. After Henk left, Mr. Copehurst saw that Ellie was very upset and was crying. He told her to leave, telephone his wife and tell her what had happened, and then disappear. Ellie gave me a frightened look. I nodded in agreement, and she dashed out the door. Mr. Copehurst then locked eyes with me and told me I could leave, too. "I can't," I responded. It was true. I couldn't. Joe Copehurst and I remained seated as we'd been ordered for perhaps 3/4 of an hour. Then another man came through the door into our room and called to Copehurst to go with him. I continued to sit there, not knowing what was going on anywhere else in the building, too afraid to imagine what might be happening. Copehurst came back out, leaving the door open so that I could see through the storeroom between Carla's office and the front office. At that moment, a German man followed Copehurst, and I heard him say in German, "Turn the keys over to the young lady." Copehurst came to me, handed me the keys, and said, "Miep, see to it that you stay out of this. It's up to you to save what can be saved here. It's in your hands." Then, before I could do anything but absorb his words, he squeezed my hand, then returned, shutting the door behind him. During this interlude, I thought two things. First, there was something familiar about the German's accent, and second, it struck me that they might have thought that I did not know anything about the people in hiding. Suddenly, what had been familiar about this man's voice clicked in my mind. He was speaking German with a distinct Viennese accent. I stood up, coming face to face with this man. I looked him right in the eye and said in German, "You're Viennese. I am from Vienna too." He stopped, surprised. He'd not expected this. Then he asked for identification. I got out my identity card, which said, "Born in Vienna, married to a Dutchman." He studied my card. Then he began to curse me, shouting terrible words and saying that I was a traitor, that I would get a terrible punishment. I remained standing as tall as I could, not reacting at all to his words. The more he shouted, the more nervous he became. At that moment, I began to feel I was getting a little more control of the situation. Here are two people standing across from each other who are from one country, from one city. One hunts Jews and the other protects them. He quieted down a bit, his face became more human. He kept studying me, and finally he said, "From personal sympathy, from me personally, you can stay. But God help you if you run away. Then we take your husband." He went to the door, opened it, then turned around and said to me, "I'll come back to make sure you're still here. One wrong move and off you go to prison too." He turned and shut me into the room alone. I had no idea where he'd gone. I had no idea what was going on in the rest of the house. I was in a terrible mental state. Then, along the corridor past Mr. Coller's private office and down the short old wooden stairway, I could hear the sound of our friends' feet. I could tell from their footsteps that they were coming down like beaten dogs. I just sat there frozen. I'd lost track of time. At some point, the two workers from downstairs in the workplace came up to me and said that they were so sorry, that they hadn't known. I can't imagine where the time had gone. Then, suddenly, Ellie was back and Henk had arrived. I realized that it was 5 o'clock and the day had passed. We all went to the bookcase and turned it away from the door leading to the hiding place. The door was locked, but otherwise undisturbed. I had an extra key. We opened the door and made our way to the hiding place. It had been ransacked. Drawers were open, things strewn all over the floors. Everywhere objects were overturned. My eyes took in a scene of terrible pillage. Then I walked into Mr. and Mrs. Frank's bedroom. On the floor, amidst the chaos of papers and books, my eye lit on the little orange-checked, cloth-bound diary that Anna had received from her father on her 13th birthday. I remembered how happy Anna had been to receive this little book to write her private thoughts in. I knew how precious her diary was to Anna. My eyes scanned the rubble for more of Anna's writings, and I saw the old accounting books and many more writing papers that Ellie and I had given to her when she had run out of pages in the checked diary. Quickly, we gathered up handfuls of pages in Anna's scrawling handwriting. My heart beat in fear that the Austrian would return and catch us among the now captured Jewish possessions. Hank was giving me a look to hurry. As I was about to leave, I passed through the bathroom. My eye caught sight of Anna's soft beige combing shawl with the colored roses and other small figures hanging on the clothes rack. Even though my arms were filled with papers, I reached out and grabbed the shawl with my fingers. I still don't know why. Trying not to drop anything, I bent to lock the door to the hiding place and returned to the office. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and began to pile in the diary, the old accounting books, and the papers. I told Ellie, I'll keep everything safe for Anna until she comes back. I shut the desk drawer, but I did not lock it. At home, Hank told me what he'd done after he'd left me. He'd gone straight back to his office to hide the money in illegal ration coupons I'd sent him off with. He and Joe Kophaus's brother then quickly walked over to the Prinsengracht and stood on the opposite side of the canal. Almost as soon as they got there, a dark green German police truck pulled up in front of 263. No one was about, and the truck did not have its siren on. Hank could see the doors to the building. Suddenly the door opened, and our friends came out in a bunch, each carrying a little something, going right from the door into the truck. There were 2 men not in uniform escorting the group. When the prisoners were all inside, a green policeman slammed the door shut and drove straight down the Prinsengracht past them. Not knowing who was left in the office or how dangerous it was, Hank returned to his office until the end of the day. Still in shock the next day, I went to work as usual. That day, several of the company representatives returned from the road and had to be told what had happened. As Mr. Frank was extremely popular, they were very depressed at the news. One of these representatives came over and asked to speak to me privately. I agreed and went with him into one of the empty offices. He told me that since the war was coming to an end, the Germans were anxious to go home. They were tired, and they wanted to take as much Dutch money as they could gather. He said, "What if you went to the Austrian Nazi from Vienna and asked him how much money he'd want to buy back the people they arrested yesterday?" I listened. As I looked at his face, I also recalled Mr. Frank's words about trusting this man. I listened to my heart, and I replied that I would go. He told me that since Mr. Frank was so popular, he would take up a collection among people who liked him so that we could have a good sum of cash to offer. Immediately, I went to the phone and called the Austrian at Gestapo headquarters. When I heard his voice on the phone, I told him who I was and asked in German if I could come and see him. He told me to come on Monday morning. On Monday, I walked to Gestapo headquarters. It was a well-known fact that people who entered this building did not always leave it again. I went directly to his office. The Austrian's desk was in the corner of the room. He sat behind it facing me when I entered. His name was Silberbauer. I'd been thrown off by the fact that he wasn't alone, so I just stood there and didn't say a word. All I did was rub my thumb against my index finger and middle fingers, the sign for money. Seeing my gesture, he replied, "Today I can do nothing. Come back tomorrow morning at 9 sharp." And then he looked down at his desk, dismissing me curtly. Early the next morning I went back. No one was in the room except Silberbauer. I got right to the point. "How much money do you want to free the people you arrested the other day?" He replied, "I'm very sorry. I can't do anything to help you. An order just came down. I can't deal as freely as I would like to." I don't know what seized me, but I said, "I don't believe you." He didn't get angry. He just shrugged and shook his head at me. "Go upstairs to my boss." Determined not to let my knees tremble, I forced myself up the steps to the room where I had been directed. I knocked on the door. No one answered, so I opened it. As the door swung open, I saw a round table filled with high-ranking Nazis. Their caps were on the table, and in the middle of the table was a radio. The radio was playing an English broadcast. Right away, I recognized the BBC. All their eyes burned into me. I realized that I had accidentally witnessed them committing a crime of treason, for which the penalty was death. I knew they would do with me what they would, so I had nothing more to lose. "Who is in charge?" I asked. One of them stood up. Looking at me with a menacing face, he came toward me. His lip curled and he pushed me with his open palm against my shoulder. "Schweinhund," he snarled, looking at me as though I were a lump of garbage, and slammed the door in my face. My heart was thundering. Fearing that any second I'd be grabbed by someone, I made my way back downstairs. With measured step, I walked toward the door of the building. Gestapo were everywhere in the corridors, like flies in fancy uniforms. I put one foot in front of the other, waiting for someone to stop me. No one did. Because I hadn't been arrested, and because I was a Christian in charge, the Pool's moving van people had not disturbed anything in the office, or the expensive spice mills below. Suddenly I realized why Kopes had wanted me to stay out of the arrest. Regardless of how much I wished I had been arrested and taken away with my friends, I saw that I was needed to save the business and Mr. Frank's machinery. It was no problem keeping it going, except for the fact that signatures were needed for checks in order for me to continue paying the staff. I went to the bank that our company used and asked for the director. I told him about the hiding and the arrests, and that I wanted to try to keep the business going for Mr. Frank, but that I had no proper signature for checks in order to. He heard me out, then told me to sign what needed to be signed, and he would authorize payment. So in spite of the worst having come to pass, life went on at the Prinsengracht. Orders for spices for sausage and pectin for jam making kept coming, and we continued to fill them. Henk continued his underground work, even though he was in danger as well. Shortly after the arrest, Henk came home one night and told me he'd had a dangerous situation occur that day with one of his illegal clients, which had made him very, very nervous. When he went back to the office, he told his contact for special work what had happened. Shortly afterward, Henk's supervisor eliminated the illegal cases from his normal caseload. On August the 25th, there was more good news from the BBC. France was liberated after 4 long years of occupation. The Allies were racing forward now. On September the 3rd, Brussels was liberated and the British had entered the south of Holland. A spirit of unrestrained optimism swept through Amsterdam, almost a kind of hysteria. On September the 5th, a day that came to be called Dolle Dinsdag, or Crazy Tuesday, parts of the German army began to retreat. These Germans were not the arrogant, healthy, well-uniformed young soldiers who had marched into Amsterdam in May 1940. They were bedraggled, shabby like us, and carrying with them whatever money and valuables they had been able to gather. Along with them, by train, by bicycle, by any means possible, also on their way to Germany or to the east of the Netherlands, went the Dutch traitors who had collaborated with the Nazis for all these long years. No one knew quite what was happening, especially the German soldiers themselves. But that day passed, and then the next, and day after day, and still nothing happened. Slowly the German presence became obvious again. The announcement that the British had entered South Holland turned out not to be true. One morning, while all this was happening, I had a question that I needed answered, and I phoned Mr. Koophuis's brother, who had been providing me with business advice. "You should ask my brother that," he replied. I was startled by his tone of voice. "How can I ask him? He's in the Amersfoort concentration camp." "No, he's on his way to see you. Go outside." I thought, what a terribly cruel joke. To say such a thing. But I dropped the telephone right out of my hands and ran outside. My heart pounding. I looked up and down the street, and there came Mr. Kophuis, waving his arms. Ellie and I ran to him, and we hugged each other hard. All three of us were laughing and crying at the same time. Together we went back toward 263, all talking at once. The good feeling of his return swept over me like a soft wave of relief. Quickly, I asked, and the others, after the arrest? He shook his head. We were all together at first, but quite soon Kala and I were separated. I know nothing about them after that. His safe and healthy return gave me great hope for all the others. We continued to wait for our liberators to arrive. Our allies seemed to be making no further progress. The Germans had dug in their heels. We were in a terrible mood of despair. The weather was already grim and nasty with stinging rains, unusually cold. None of us had any strength to brace ourselves for what was shaping up to be a particularly unpleasant winter. The situation deteriorated rapidly when the rivers and canals froze up in November and barges could no longer bring food into the city. Black market prices doubled, tripled, and multiplied again. For some weeks I had been leaving my bicycle at home when I went to work. It was now too dangerous. A German, seeing a functional bicycle, would just take it and ride away, leaving you standing. I couldn't risk losing my bicycle. As there was no transportation, people had to go out into the countryside to search for food. People used anything they could find. Hand carts, baby carriages, bicycles with wooden wheels, push carts, anything. We had been living on very little food before, and now the whole population began to live from hand to mouth, staying one step from starvation at all times. I began to make trips out to the country, too, each time farther and farther. As the winter began, people were becoming as thin as skeletons. Everyone, including us, was ragged and threadbare in every way. Children wore shoes with toes cut out or made from pieces of board or bits of leather and tied to their feet with string. Cars ran on cooking gas, which was carried atop the car roofs in balloon-like contraptions with chimneys hanging down the rear of the car. During the dark winter nights, we made a little light from a piece of cotton thread floating in a small amount of oil in a glass of water. The thread burned with a minute, flickering yellow flame. Because people had taken to boiling laundry in the absence of soap of any sort, everything smelled sour and sweetish. Some of the poorest people began to be covered in red sores which came from scabies caused by lack of soap. Somehow, with no electricity and no coal, our business went on. Much reduced, but enough to keep us all going. We could still get imitation spices for sausage making. Many businesses had shut down. One of our steady customers was a German-born man who was a chef. Despite his nationality, he was a good man. During the occupation, he had been forced to cook for the German soldiers. He always paid in cash, and he told Kophuis that if any of us were ever unable to get food, we should come to him and he would help us. The only trouble was that he worked in a town called Kampen, way off in the east of the Netherlands. The time did come when we had no more food. Mr. Kophuis urged me to go and see this man. I went with the wife of one of our salesmen. No longer did she have a functional bicycle, so we borrowed one for her from our friends across the street. We set off in the gloomy gray light of dawn. It was quite a long way to Kampen, and we rode all day. Along the way, we saw many of our countrymen going from farm to farm, trying to obtain food any way they could. The day was overcast, cold. People were wrapped in all the clothes they had. We came to Kampen and the military barracks where this man worked. He secretly smuggled us inside, right to the kitchen. It happened to be my birthday, February the 15th, 1945. I had been hungry for a long time now, especially for fat and protein, which had all but disappeared from my diet. He began to put rich foods before us. Steak, creamy butter. We ate and ate this wonderful meal. Neither of us could stop eating, so naturally we overate. Because we were no longer used to real food, we both began to go very, very woozy. I became deathly sick to my stomach and couldn't move, couldn't leave the barracks. The cook began to get very scared, not knowing what to do with us. All he could think of was to put us into an empty prison cell. Then he said he'd be back to get us at 5 a.m. In the cell there was nothing but an empty pail. No blankets, nothing. The pail was not empty long. I was sick all night. High fever, chills, agonizing cramps. I thought it was the end of me. The night passed, and at 5 a.m, the cook came back and spirited us away, half carrying me to my bicycle. Throughout all my misery, I hadn't forgotten the food I was to take back to Amsterdam, and I carried it with me. Somehow I found the strength and mounted my bicycle and rode off with my friend, who was in much better shape than I. Right away we came to a bridge which was guarded by German soldiers. Usually at moments like this, everybody was stopped by the soldiers before being permitted to cross the bridge. Men often were physically searched and asked for papers. Women were normally just asked for papers and inspected visually. The meat and other food I was carrying were bulging from under my clothes and bursting out of our bags. Since there was nothing else to do, we bravely rode up to the bridge toward the soldiers on guard. But instead of making a motion for papers, they just waved us through. We couldn't believe our luck. By the time we got to Amsterdam, we had missed the curfew. To our surprise, there stood the green police at the bridge to the Amstel with a new inspection station. At the sight of the green uniforms, we were filled with fear, not just for the food we had with us, but for our safety as well. Again, our luck held. I knew that Hank would be filled with terrible thoughts about my safety. I knew, though, that neither he nor I would say anything about our fears. This was the risk we all took every day. Risks and danger were with us always. There was no way to survive without taking risks. You just did it. By midwinter, the Germans had reduced our rations to 500 calories a day. Each frozen day was an obstacle to be surmounted. Enough warmth not to freeze. The minimum calories to keep going. People everywhere in Amsterdam were perishing daily of starvation. Sometimes they would just sit down at the side of the road and die. Sometimes they were so weak that they died of diphtheria, typhoid, or just plain cold. Each day people would line up at soup kitchens to get a bucket of something warm to put in their stomachs. All day people scavenged for bits of coal in the old coal yards. Railroad ties were dug up for wood. If you had a wooden staircase standing in the garden, you might wake up in the morning and find your staircase gone. At last March came, and then April, but still the winter raged. Everywhere as the earth thawed, there was stench. Whether the sickly smell of endlessly boiling tulip bulbs, or pulpy sugar beets, or badly washed clothing hanging to dry, or bodies wrapped too long in ragged clothes. All conversations centered on food. Food obsessions were affecting all our minds. Always my fantasy would return to chocolate, hot chocolate, frothy like satin. The glands under my tongue would ache with longing. President Roosevelt died on April the 12th, and Vienna, the place of my birth, fell to the Russians on April the 13th. Montgomery had crossed over the Rhine and was moving toward Bremen and Hamburg. The news was that all around us, Europe lay in ruins, the Germans defeated on all fronts. Like a great half-circle around Holland, freedom had arrived. And still we waited daily. Mussolini was captured in Como, on the Swiss border, and then was dead. He and his mistress were hung up by their feet at a gasoline station in Milan. And then, on May the 1st, we heard the news that I had hoped and prayed for. Hitler was dead. Somehow, it was not enough. The warming temperature and the lengthening of the days eased two of our crushing problems, lack of heat and light, but the problem of food was more critical. My mind was never clear anymore. The daily search for food took all my strength and concentration. Each day was a fight to keep from sinking totally, as others were doing everywhere I turned. May brought beautiful weather, blue skies for once, patches of green appearing despite the devastation everywhere in Amsterdam. On Friday, the 4th of May, 1945, Henk came home to tell me the news. The war was over. The words were so thrilling to me that my knees went weak. I thought, can it really be true? I looked back into Henk's clear eyes. It must be, I realized. Henk could always be trusted. What would happen next? The Germans were still in our midst. They had lost the war now and must be furious. We mustn't be careless now, Henk warned me. Being careless could cost a life, and how wasteful now that the war was won. And our friends in the concentration camps, wherever they had been sent, could they also be free? The streets were crowded with people. People were bringing out paper, wood, old clothes, anything to burn. Young people were dancing around big bonfires. Old people were walking up and down the street, laughing and embracing each other. The feeling everywhere was exhilarating, lovely. Germans were nowhere to be seen. We started back toward home. I knew we'd hardly be able to sleep this night. The sky was just beginning to darken. I noticed how beautiful the twilight sky was. Then, right about the rooftops, I saw a flock of pigeons swooping and circling. It struck me that it was a very long time since I had seen any birds in Amsterdam. Of course, I thought, birds could so easily get away. There couldn't have been food for them to eat either. Under the Germans, it had been against the law to keep pigeons. These pigeons must have been kept hidden throughout the occupation. Now, at the news, they'd been set free. They were like confetti thrown up against the sky. There were pigeons again above the roofs of Amsterdam. They were free, so were we. I took down the blackout curtains. For the first night in 5 years, we could look outside and see the moon. We heard that the German soldiers were assembling in various parts of Holland and then leaving. Suddenly they were gone. There was a feeling everywhere that a miracle had happened. Queen Wilhelmina returned to her beloved Holland, which was now devastated and almost starved. Like our country, she had endured. The celebrations continued for days. The Canadian and Dutch national anthems were played again and again. Music and dancing in the streets, a barrel organ that had been found somewhere, old accordions played. Anything that made music. Right away, people planted marigold seeds so that the color that the Germans had forbidden, orange, the color of our royal house, would grow. People who had been in hiding came out onto the streets. Jews came out, rubbing eyes that were unused to sunlight, their faces yellow and pinched and distrustful. Church bells rang everywhere. Streamers flew. To wake up and go through a whole day without any sense of danger was amazing. And right away, Henk and I and everyone else began waiting to see just who would be coming home to us. Shocking, unimaginable accounts circulated of the liberation of the German concentration camps. Throughout the occupation, we'd heard rumors of gassings, murder, brutality, poor living conditions in these camps, but none of us could have imagined such atrocities. The facts had far surpassed even our most pessimistic imaginings. I couldn't listen to or read the stories, and turned away from the photos printed in the first free newspapers. I couldn't allow myself to think about these reports. I needed to do everything I could to keep my optimism about our friends. It would have been unbearable to think otherwise. Jews and others who had spent years as slaves of the Nazis began to come back, their faces shriveled, so that it was impossible to tell their ages. Jews from the camps all had blue numbers tattooed on their arms. Children who no longer knew their birthdays and names could not recognize their families because they had been separated for so long. People had been through so much misery that no one had much interest in the suffering of others. I heard it said that where the Jews had looked like everyone else before, now, after what they had endured, those who returned looked different. Every day Hank sat at his desk at the central station and processed people. To everyone he would ask for news about Otto Frank and his wife, Edith, or anything of their daughters, Margot and Anna. And always the head would shake no. No one knew anything of our friends. We learned that Harry Kaller was alive, that in fact he had escaped from the Amersfoort camp and had been in hiding in his own home through the hunger winter, cared for by his wife. Day after day, Hank would continue to ask for news about the Frank family. Always expecting one more ravaged head to shake no, Hank finally heard a voice reply to his question. "Mister, I have seen Otto Frank, and he is coming back." Hank flew home that day to tell me. It was June the 3rd, 1945. My heart took flight. Deep down, I'd always known that he would come back, that the others would, too. Just then, my eye caught sight of a figure passing outside our window. My throat closed. I ran outside. There was Mr. Frank himself walking toward our door. He was thin, but he'd always been thin. He carried a little bundle. My eyes swam. My heart melted. Suddenly I was afraid to know more. I didn't want to know what had happened. I knew I could not ask. We stood facing each other, speechless. Finally, Frank spoke. "Miep," he said quietly. "Miep. Edith is not coming back." My throat was pierced. I tried to hide my reaction to his thunderbolt. He went on, "But I have great hope for Margot and Anna." He still stood there. "Miep, I came here because you and Hank are the ones closest to me who are still here." I grabbed his bundle from his hand. "Come. You stay right here with us. You have a room here with us for as long as you want." He came inside. I made up a bedroom for him and put everything we had into a fine meal for him. Mr. Frank told me that he had ended up in Auschwitz. That was the last time he'd seen Edith, Margot, and Anna. The men had been separated from the women immediately. When the Russians liberated the camp in January, he had been taken on a very long trip to Odessa. Then from there to Marseille, and at last to Holland. He told us these few things in his soft voice. He spoke very little, but between us there was no need for words. Mr. Frank settled in with Hank and me. Right away he came back to the office and took his place again as the head of the business. I know he was relieved to have something to do each day. Meanwhile, he began exploring the network of information on Jews in the camps, the refugee agencies, the daily lists, the most crucial word-of-mouth information, trying everything to get news about Margot and Anna. When Auschwitz was liberated, Otto Frank had gone right away to the women's camp to find out about his wife and children. In the chaos and desolation of the camps, he had learned that Edith had died shortly before the liberation. He had also learned that in all likelihood Margot and Anna had been transferred to another camp, along with Mrs. von Dahn. The camp was called Bergen-Belsen and was quite a distance from Auschwitz. That was as far as the trail had gone. Now he was trying to pick up the search. As to the other men, Mr. Frank had lost track of Albert Dussel. He had no idea what had happened to him after Auschwitz. Mr. von Dahn he had seen with his own eyes on the way to be gassed. and Peter von Dahn had come to visit Frank in the Auschwitz infirmary. Mr. Frank knew that right before the liberation of the camp, the Germans had taken groups of prisoners with them in their retreat. Peter had been in one of these groups. There was no further news about him. Mr. Frank held high hopes for the girls because Bergen-Belsen was not a death camp. There were no gassings there. It was a work camp, filled with hunger and disease, but with no apparatus for liquidation. Margot and Anna had been strong young women. I too lived on hope for Margot and Anna. In some deep part of me, like a rock, I counted on their survival and their safe return to Amsterdam. Mr. Frank had written for news to several Dutch people who he had learned had been in Bergen-Belsen. Through word of mouth, people were being reunited every day. Daily he waited for answers to his letters and for the new lists of survivors to be released and posted. Every time there was a knock at the door or footfalls on the steps, all our hearts would stand still. Perhaps Margot and Anna had found their way back home, and we could see them with our own eyes at last. Anna's 16th birthday was coming on June the 12th. Perhaps we hoped. But then the birthday came and went, and still no news. Our vegetable man came back from the camp with frozen feet. I saw him back in his shop, and we greeted each other like long-lost friends. One morning, Mr. Frank and I were alone in the office, opening mail. He was standing beside me, and I was sitting at my desk. I was vaguely aware of the sound of a letter being slit open. Then, a moment of silence. Something made me look away from my mail. Then, Otto Frank's voice, toneless, totally crushed. Miep. My eyes looked up at him, seeking out his eyes. Miep. He gripped a sheet of paper in both his hands. I've gotten a letter from the nurse in Rotterdam. Miep. Margot and Anna are not coming back. We stayed there like that, both struck by lightning. Burnt thoroughly through our hearts, our eyes fixed on each other's. Then Mr. Frank walked toward his office, and in that defeated voice said, I'll be in my office. I sat at my desk utterly crushed. Everything that had happened before I could somehow accept. Like it or not, I had to accept it. But this, I could not accept. It was one thing I'd been sure would not happen. I reached into the drawer on the side of my desk and took out the papers that had been waiting there for Anna for nearly a year now. No one, including me, had touched them. Now Anna was not coming back for her diary. I took out all the papers, placing the little orange check diary on top, and carried everything into Mr. Frank's office. He was sitting at his desk, his eyes murky with shock. I held out the diary and the papers to him. I said, Here is your daughter Anna's legacy to you. I could tell that he recognized the diary. He had given it to her just over 3 years before, on her 13th birthday, right before going into hiding. He touched it with the tips of his fingers. I pressed everything into his hands. Then I left his office, closing the door quietly. I made our home as cozy as I could and cooked meals for all of us from whatever I could scrape up. We were still being rationed, and it was impossible to make interesting meals, as all the ingredients we had were basics, with no variety. But I had acquired a knack for making the best of little, and I kept everyone reasonably well fed. Once Mr. Frank had really settled in with us, he said to me, Miep, Now you must call me Otto. Now we are family. All of us were weak, depleted, slow-blooded. I had no reserve of energy anymore, but fortunately, I no longer needed great strength and energy. None of us was much for conversation, but our common memories kept us bonded together. Slowly, our railways and bridges and dikes were being rebuilt. Otto told me that before they had gone into hiding, he had managed to place some of Edith's furniture from the Mervedeplein with friends. He had found that his possessions had been safe throughout the war, and now he would move them in with us. The day arrived, and I saw the big grandfather clock that had come all the way from Frankfurt in 1933, the clock that needed to be wound every few weeks and ticked with the softest of heartbeats. I saw the small, delicate antique secretary, veneered with mahogany, carried through the room. Then Frank showed me the charcoal drawing of the sweet, big cat nursing its little kittens that had so touched me years earlier. He presented everything to me. One day, 2 bicycles arrived for Mr. Frank from friends of his in England. One for you and one for me. I took it. I had never before in my life had a brand new bicycle. No one in the neighborhood had anything new. I imagined that they eyed our new bicycles jealously. Another package arrived for Mr. Frank. This one bore elaborate labels from America, from friends who had safely spent the war there. Otto opened the package carefully. There were tins and American cigarettes and several small packets. Frank suggested I open them and take a look at what there was. The first I opened sent an aroma of cocoa up into my face. It was overwhelming. I felt the texture, so soft and powdery, the color so dark brown. Seeing it and smelling the cocoa, I began to cry. It was unbelievable to me that I was seeing real cocoa again. The final lists of Jewish survivors were posted by the Red Cross. Of those who had been deported by the Germans, very few had returned to the Netherlands. Not even 1 in 20. Of those who had gone into hiding, at least 1/3 had survived. All those who had survived had lost just about everything. Slowly, bit by bit, we learned that Albert Dussel had died in the Neuengamme camp. That Peter von Dahn hadn't died on the death march away from Auschwitz, but had somehow survived it and been placed in Mauthausen, only to die there on the very day that the camp was liberated by the Americans. Through information gathered from eyewitness survivors, we learned that Margot and Anna had been separated at Auschwitz from their mother, Edith Frank, who had spent the last weeks of her life there alone. Margot and Anna had been transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where they had been relatively healthy at first, but then, in the early months of 1945, had both fallen ill with typhus. In February or March, Margot had succumbed. And then Anna, totally alone, had succumbed to typhus as well, just a few short weeks before the liberation of the camp. There were still many displaced persons, and borders that were not what they had been, so there was no way to know for sure the fate of many others who did not return. For some, it was possible not to give up hope. In the evenings, after Henk, Otto, and I had returned from our offices, and I'd fixed our evening meal, Otto began to translate bits of Anna's diary into German for his mother, who lived in Basel. Mr. Frank would include these translations with his letters to her. But when he would ask me to listen to what Anna had written, I'd have to say no. I could not bring myself to listen. It was much too upsetting for me. 1946 came, and still we stayed poor. Still there was nothing. I was now past my middle 30s. My childbearing years were quickly passing. My own dream of motherhood had greatly changed because of what had happened in Holland. I was glad no child of ours had had to endure the terrible war years. After the war, we did not speak about the subject of having children. I also had a great deal of trouble believing any more in the existence of God. Hank had been a non-believer before and throughout the war, and he continued that way. But I had a craving to read on the subject, and I began to read the Old Testament. Then I read the New Testament. Then, with deep interest, I read studies of many different religions, books on Judaism, books on Catholicism, Protestantism, anything I could lay my hands on. Everything I read was rich and interesting, yet I was always hungry for more. The dark years had pulled down my inner supports, and I was looking for something to replace them. Although a slow reconstruction and renewal was taking place, we Dutch continued to harbor a deep and strong feeling of hatred for the suffering we'd been made to endure at the hands of our savage German oppressors. For 5 solid years, we'd been without contact with the outside world. We'd been utterly humiliated, brought to our knees. The lives of good, innocent people had been interrupted and destroyed. We felt no stirrings of forgiveness. Mr. Frank had begun to have small gatherings of friends for coffee on Sundays. These were all Jews who had survived untold suffering. They'd exchange information about where they'd been. Auschwitz, Sobibor, facts about transport, states, but never about what had happened to them personally. I could see that it was too difficult to talk about many things, and when they were together, it was not necessary. At one of these Sunday get-togethers, Frank mentioned that he had a diary written by his daughter, Anna. One of the men at the gathering asked Frank if he might read it. With great reluctance, Mr. Frank gave him the bits he had translated. Then the man asked Frank for permission to show the diary to a friend of his, a well-known historian. Frank was against it, but his friend cajoled, and finally Frank said yes. After he had read Anna's diary, this historian began a campaign to get Mr. Frank to allow Anna's diary to be published. Frank was very much against such a thing, and was adamant in his refusal. The historian and his friend wore Otto Frank down, arguing with him. They said that it was Frank's duty to share Anna's story with others, that her diary was a war document, and very important because it expressed a unique voice of a young person in hiding. Although very reluctant, Frank agreed to allow a small edited edition to be printed by Contact publishers in Amsterdam. It was printed with the title Het Achterhuis, the Annex, which was Anna's name for the hiding place. It was praised in some quarters, but there was indifference on the part of many people who had lived through such unpleasant situations themselves. Most people wanted to forget the war, to put it behind them and move on. Nonetheless, Anna's diary was reprinted and gathered a wider audience. Always Otto would tell me, "Miep, you must read it." But always I couldn't. I couldn't relive the miseries, and I wouldn't rekindle the terrible losses. Hank, too, declined to read Anna's words. At last, food supplies, though still sparse, were being restored. Again, healthy, fat Dutch cows grazed in the countryside. The trains began to run again, and the Amsterdam streetcars as well. Rubble had been cleared away. After the liberation, the unity that had developed during our occupation quickly disappeared, and people again divided into groups and factions that were at odds with each other. Everyone returned to his old ways, to his own class, to his own political group. People had changed less than I would have thought. However, Amsterdam had changed, from the friendly town it had been to a modern, more anonymous city. Mr. Frank's interest in the business also started to wane. Since the publication of Anna's diary, letters had begun to come to him from children and adults. Conscientiously, Mr. Frank answered each letter, His office on the Prinsengracht became the place where he conducted matters pertaining to Anna's diary. Then, on a beautiful warm day in 1947, I rode my bicycle to the Prinsengracht for the last time. Quietly, I said goodbye to everyone. I had decided that the care of the men and our own home was now my full-time job. I was no longer the young girl longing for the freedom and independence that a job would give. Nothing in Amsterdam was as it had been before, and neither was I. The second printing of the diary sold out, and another printing was planned. And again, Mr. Frank would say to me, "Miep, you must read Anna's writing. Who would have imagined what went on in her quick little mind?" Otto was never discouraged by my continuing refusal. He would always wait a while, and then ask me again. Finally, I gave in to his insistence. The next time I was totally alone on a warm day, I took the second printing of the diary, went to my room and shut the door. With an awful fear in my heart, I began to read. I read the whole diary without stopping. From the first word I heard Anna's voice come back from where she'd gone to speak to me. I lost track of time. Anna's voice tumbled out of the book, so full of life, moods, feelings. She was no longer gone and destroyed. She was alive again in my mind. I read to the very end. I was surprised by how much had happened in hiding that I'd known nothing about. Immediately, I was thankful that I hadn't read the diary after the arrest, during the final 9 months of the occupation, while it had stayed in my desk drawer right beside me every day. Had I read it, I would have had to burn the diary, because it would have been too dangerous for people about whom Anna had written. When I had read the last word, I didn't feel the pain I'd anticipated. I was glad I'd read it at last. The emptiness in my heart was eased. So much had been lost, but now Anna's voice would never be lost. My young friend had left a remarkable legacy to the world. But always, every day of my life, I've wished that things had been different. That even had Anna's diary been lost to the world, Anna and the others might somehow have been saved. Not a day goes by that I do not grieve for them.